Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The basement door swung open with a creak that echoed through the empty house. I stood at the top of the stairs, my hand frozen on the light switch, staring into the darkness below. I'd been in this house 100 times, but I'd never ventured into the basement. Now, as I house sat for my friend Emily, I found myself drawn to that forbidding space beneath my feet. I flicked on the light, and a dim bulb flickered to life, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. Taking a deep breath, I descended the creaking wooden steps, each one groaning under my weight, as if warning me to turn back. The air grew colder as I reached the bottom, and the musty smell of damp earth and old cardboard boxes filled my nostrils. I scanned the cluttered space, taking in the stacks of dusty storage containers, old furniture draped in sheets, and cobweb-covered shelves lining the walls. As my eyes adjusted to the gloom, something caught my attention. In the far corner of the basement, partially hidden behind a tall bookshelf, was a section of wall that looked different. The paint was fresher, newer than the rest of the dingy basement walls. Curiosity piqued. I made my way over, pushing aside boxes and ducking under low-hanging pipes. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't just a section of newer wall. It was a door. A small wooden door, no more than 4 feet tall, was set into the wall, its edges almost imperceptible against the fresh paint. My heart began to race as I ran my fingers along the outline of the door. Why would Emily have a hidden door in her basement? And why had she never mentioned it? There was no handle, just a small, tarnished latch. My hand trembled as I reached for it, a voice in the back of my mind screaming at me to leave it alone, to go back upstairs and forget I'd ever seen it. But I couldn't resist. With a deep breath, I flipped the latch and pulled. The door swung open with surprising ease, revealing a dark, narrow passage beyond. The smell that wafted out was even mustier than the basement, tinged with something else I couldn't quite place. Something wrong. I fumbled for my phone, turning on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating rough stone walls that seemed to absorb the light. The passage stretched ahead, curving slightly to the left and disappearing into blackness. Every instinct told me to close the door and run, but my feet seemed to move of their own accord. I ducked through the low entrance, my back scraping against the top of the doorframe. The air inside was thick and stale, as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. I moved slowly down the passage, my phone's light casting eerie shadows on the walls. Water dripped somewhere in the distance, each drop echoing ominously. The curve of the passage was gradual, and I realized I was moving in a spiral, descending deeper beneath the house. After what felt like an eternity, the passage opened up into a small, circular room. My light swept across the space, and I gasped, nearly dropping my phone. The walls were covered in photographs, hundreds, maybe thousands of them, overlapping and crowding every inch of available space. But these weren't family photos or vacation snapshots. These were surveillance photos, grainy, long-distance shots of people going about their daily lives, unaware they were being watched. I stepped closer, my hand shaking as I examined the nearest picture. It showed a woman walking her dog, her face captured in profile. The next was a man getting into his car, keys in hand. Another showed a child playing in a backyard. With growing horror, I realized I recognized some of the people. There was the barista from the coffee shop down the street, the old man who always sat in the park feeding pigeons, the jogger I saw every morning on my way to work. In the center of the room stood a small table. On it lay a leather-bound journal, its pages yellow with age. Next to it was a stack of photographs, more recent than those on the walls. With trembling fingers, I picked up the top photo. It was me, walking into Emily's house yesterday, suitcase in hand. The sound of my own panicked breathing filled the room as I flipped through the stack. They were all of me, taken over the past few months. Me at work, at the grocery store, meeting friends for dinner. Every aspect of my life had been documented by an unseen watcher. I dropped the photos, my mind reeling. What was this place? Why did Emily have a secret room filled with surveillance photos? And why was I the latest subject? A new sound cut through the silence, a soft scraping noise coming from the passage behind me. I whirled around, my light bouncing wildly off the stone walls. There was nothing there, but the noise continued, growing louder. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming down the passage. Panic seized me. I had to get out. I lunged for the exit, but in my haste, I knocked over the table. The journal fell open, and a slip of paper fluttered to the ground. Despite my terror, I couldn't help but look. It was a note, written in Emily's familiar handwriting. The watcher must always have a watched. I'm sorry, but it's your turn now. The footsteps were getting closer. I could hear heavy breathing now, echoing off the stone walls. I ran, ducking into the passage and scrambling back the way I'd come. The beam of my flashlight bounced wildly, casting disorienting shadows as I fled. I could feel the presence behind me, getting closer with each passing second. The air grew thicker, making it hard to breathe. The curve of the passage seemed tighter now, the ceiling lower, as if the very walls were trying to trap me. Just when I thought my lungs would burst, I saw the outline of the small door ahead. I threw myself at it, tumbling through the opening and landing hard on the basement floor. Without looking back, I slammed the door shut and fumbled with the latch, my fingers slipping in my panic. As the latch clicked into place, a heavy thud came from the other side, as if something had thrown itself against the door. I scrambled backward, my eyes fixed on the small wooden barrier that now seemed terrifyingly inadequate. The basement felt different now. The shadows seemed deeper, the silence more oppressive. I got to my feet, never taking my eyes off the hidden door, and began backing toward the stairs. Something moved in my peripheral vision. A shadow, darker than the rest, detached itself from the wall and glided across the room. I spun, trying to track its movement, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. Another shadow flitted by on my other side, and another. The basement was coming alive with moving darkness, each shadow seeming to reach out for me as it passed. I turned and ran, taking the stairs two at a time. I burst through the basement door, slamming it behind me and leaning against it, gasping for breath. The house was silent, but it no longer felt empty. There was a weight to the air, a presence that pressed in from all sides. My phone buzzed in my pocket, making me jump. With shaking hands, I pulled it out. It was a text from an unknown number. "Welcome to the Watched. Don't bother running. We see everything." As if on cue, I heard a click and a whir. Slowly, I turned toward the sound. There, in the corner of the living room ceiling, a security camera I'd never noticed before turned to point directly at me. Its red light blinked steadily, like a malevolent eye. I ran to the front door, yanking it open and bursting out into the night. The street was deserted, the houses dark and silent. As I stood there, gasping and shivering, a streetlight flickered and went out, then another, and another. Darkness crept toward me like a living thing. In the distance, a figure stood beneath the last functioning streetlight. As I watched, paralyzed with fear, it raised a camera to its eye and snapped a picture. The flash momentarily illuminated the face behind the camera. It was Emily. The light went out, plunging the street into total darkness. I couldn't see, couldn't think. All I knew was that I had to run, had to get away. But as I stumbled blindly down the sidewalk, a chilling realization settled over me. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. The watchers were everywhere, and I was now one of the watched. In the darkness, cameras clicked and whirred, documenting every step of my futile escape. And somewhere, in a hidden room beneath an ordinary house, A new name was being added to an ancient journal. Mine. The headlights of my car cut through the inky darkness, illuminating a road sign I'd never seen before. "Welcome to Mill Haven," it read, the paint peeling and faded. I squinted at my GPS, but the screen had gone dark, lost and low on gas. I had no choice but to hope this town had a place to fill up and maybe grab a coffee. Little did I know, I was about to drive into a nightmare from which there might be no escape. The clock on my dashboard read 11:43 p.m. as I rolled into what I assumed was the main street of Millhaven. The road was empty, lined with buildings that looked like they hadn't been updated since the 1950s. Flickering streetlights cast an eerie glow over the deserted sidewalks. I spotted a gas station up ahead, its faded sign a beacon of hope in this ghost town. As I pulled up to the pump, I noticed a figure in the window of the small attached convenience store. An old man stared out at me, his face expressionless. I waved, trying to be friendly, but he didn't move. The pump clicked as I filled my tank, the sound echoing in the unsettling quiet. No crickets chirped, no distant dogs barked. It was as if the whole town was holding its breath. Inside the store, a bell jingled as I pushed open the door. The old man was now behind the counter, still staring at me with that blank expression. "Evening," I said, forcing a smile. "Just the gas and a coffee, please." He didn't respond, didn't even blink, just kept staring. I cleared my throat, uncomfortable. Is the coffee machine working?" I gestured to the pot behind him. Slowly, so slowly it made my skin crawl. He turned and poured me a cup. When he handed it to me, his fingers brushed mine. They were ice cold. "That'll be $47.50, he said, his voice a dry whisper. I handed him my credit card, eager to get out of there. He swiped it and handed it back, along with a receipt. As I turned to leave, he spoke again. "You'll be staying in Millhaven tonight." I froze, my hand on the door. "Excuse me?" "No one leaves Millhaven after midnight," he said, as if reciting an ancient law. "There's a motel down the street. You'll stay there." I laughed nervously. "Thanks, but I really need to get back on the road." "Which way to the highway?" His stare intensified. "You'll stay in Millhaven tonight," he repeated. A chill ran down my spine. Without another word, I pushed open the door and hurried to my car. As I started the engine, I glanced back at the store. The old man was gone. I pulled out of the gas station, my hands tight on the wheel. The sooner I was out of this creepy town, the better. I drove down the main street, looking for signs to the highway. But there were none. Every street I turned down seemed to loop back to the center of town. After 15 minutes of increasingly panicked driving, I found myself back at the gas station. The old man was outside now, watching me, and he wasn't alone. A small group of people had gathered, all staring at my car with the same blank expression. My heart pounding, I sped past them, determined to find a way out. But no matter which direction I drove, I always ended up back in the center of Millhaven. It was like being trapped in a maze where all paths led to the same dead end. The clock on my dashboard now read 12:01 a.m. I'd been driving in circles for nearly 20 minutes. As I passed the town square for what felt like the 100th time, I noticed more people had come out onto the streets. They lined the sidewalks, silent and still, all watching me. Panic rising in my throat, I pulled over and grabbed my phone. No signal. Of course. I tried the GPS again, but the screen remained stubbornly blank. I was trapped in a town that seemed to exist outside of time and technology, surrounded by people who looked at me like I was their next meal. A tap on my window made me jump. A woman stood there, her face as expressionless as all the others. She motioned for me to roll down the window. Against my better judgment, I did, but only a crack. "You need to check into the motel now," she said, her voice flat and emotionless. "It's not safe to be out after midnight." "What's going on here?" I demanded, my voice shaking despite my efforts to sound brave. "Why can't I leave?" She tilted her head, like my question confused her. "No one leaves Millhaven after midnight," she said, echoing the old man's words. "It's for your own safety. The motel is just down the street. Room 13 is ready for you." Before I could respond, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd of watchers. I sat there, my mind racing. This couldn't be real. Maybe I'd fallen asleep at the wheel and this was all some bizarre dream. But the chill in the air felt real enough, as did the growing sense of dread in the pit of my stomach. Seeing no other option, I started the car and drove to the motel. It was an old, run-down place, its neon sign flickering weakly in the night. The parking lot was full of cars, all covered in a thick layer of dust as if they hadn't moved in years. The man at the front desk didn't ask for my name or credit card. He simply handed me a key with the number 13 on it. "Enjoy your stay," he said, his voice as lifeless as his eyes. Room 13 was at the end of a long, dimly lit hallway. The key stuck in the lock, and I had to jiggle it several times before the door finally swung open. The room was small and dated, with peeling wallpaper and a musty smell that made me wrinkle my nose. I closed the door behind me, making sure to lock it, then sank onto the bed. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of what was happening. I pulled out my phone again, desperately hoping for a signal, but the screen remained stubbornly empty. A noise outside made me jump. I crept to the window and peeked through the dusty curtains. People were gathering in the parking lot, dozens of them, all standing perfectly still and staring up at my room. In the dim light, their eyes seemed to glow with an unnatural intensity. I stumbled back from the window, my heart racing. This couldn't be happening. It had to be a dream, a hallucination, anything but reality. I pinched myself hard, hoping to wake up, but nothing changed. The room remained stubbornly real, and the soft murmur of voices outside grew louder. Desperate for answers, I tried the TV, but the screen showed only static. The phone on the bedside table was dead. Even the clock on the wall was frozen, its hands stuck at midnight. As the night wore on, I paced the small room, jumping at every creak and groan of the old building. The voices outside grew louder, rising and falling like waves. Sometimes I thought I could make out words, but they were in a language I didn't understand. Around what I guessed was dawn, the voices suddenly stopped. The silence was almost worse than the noise. I peered out the window again. The parking lot was empty, no sign of the crowd that had gathered there during the night. Exhausted and confused, I decided to risk leaving the room. The hallway was deserted, the air thick with dust. At the front desk, a different man stood, his face as blank as all the others I'd seen. "Good morning," I said, my voice hoarse. I need to leave now." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Of course, everyone leaves Millhaven in the morning. But remember, if you're ever passing through again, be sure to arrive before midnight. It's not safe to be out after dark." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. I hurried out to my car, half expecting it to be gone or not start. But it was there, and the engine roared to life on the first try. As I drove out of town, I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, expecting to see the people of Millhaven following me. But the road behind me remained empty. My GPS suddenly sprang to life, showing me the way back to the highway. I drove for hours, putting as much distance between myself and Millhaven as possible. But even as the familiar landscape of the highway surrounded me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had fundamentally changed, that I had brushed against something dark and unknowable, and it had left its mark on me. As night fell, I found myself checking the clock obsessively, a new fear growing in my heart. What if it wasn't just Millhaven? What if every town became a trap after midnight? The headlights of my car cut through the darkness, and every flickering streetlight made me flinch. I knew one thing for certain. I would never again take a late-night detour without checking the name of the town I was entering. And if I ever saw a sign welcoming me to Millhaven again, I would turn around and drive as fast and as far as I could in the opposite direction. Because in Millhaven, the night belongs to them, and once you're caught there after midnight, you might never truly leave. The snap of a twig under my boot echoed through the silent forest, and I froze. This wasn't right. The well-worn trail I'd been following for hours had disappeared, replaced by dense underbrush and towering trees that seemed to watch my every move. As the realization sank in that I was hopelessly lost, a chill ran down my spine. Little did I know, getting lost was about to become the least of my worries. I'd set out early that morning, eager to tackle one of the most popular hiking trails in the state park. The weather was perfect, crisp autumn air, a light breeze, and the promise of stunning fall foliage. I'd done this hike a dozen times before, always sticking to the main path and returning before sunset. But today, something had drawn me off course. It started with a glimpse of vibrant red leaves just off the trail. I'd stepped closer for a better look, then spotted an interesting rock formation a little further on. Before I knew it, I'd wandered far from the marked path, lured deeper into the woods by one natural wonder after another. Now, as I stood in a small clearing I didn't recognize, panic began to set in. The sun was sinking lower in the sky, painting the forest in long shadows. I pulled out my phone, but as expected, there was no signal. The map I'd brought was useless without any landmarks to orient myself. Taking a deep breath, I tried to retrace my steps, but every tree looked the same, every path equally unfamiliar. As I pushed through a thick patch of bushes, my foot caught on something, and I stumbled. Reaching down to free my boot, my hand brushed against something smooth and cold. Metal. Curious. I pushed aside the leaves and moss. It was an old canteen, rusted and dented. Next to it lay a tattered backpack, half buried in the dirt. My heart rate quickened as I realized I'd stumbled upon someone's abandoned campsite. I looked around, taking in details I'd missed before. There was a collapsed tent, its fabric rotted and torn. Nearby, a circle of stones marked what must have been a fire pit. But something was off about the scene. It looked like whoever had been here left in a hurry. Personal items were scattered around. A book with swollen, illegible pages, a broken pair of glasses, even a wallet. With trembling hands, I picked up the wallet. The leather was cracked and weathered, but I could still make out a driver's license inside. The photo showed a young man with a friendly smile. The issue date was from 5 years ago. A rustling sound made me whirl around, dropping the wallet. The forest had gone eerily quiet. No birds chirping, no insects buzzing. Just an oppressive silence that seemed to press in from all sides. Then I heard it. A whisper, so faint I thought I'd imagined it, but it came again, clearer this time. "Help us," it seemed to say. The words carried on a breeze I couldn't feel. My skin prickled with goosebumps. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the stillness. "Is someone there?" No response, just that unnatural silence. The light was fading fast now, the shadows growing longer and deeper. I knew I needed to find shelter for the night. As much as the abandoned campsite unsettled me, it was the best option I had. I set about gathering what usable supplies I could find. The tent was a lost cause, but I managed to salvage a tarp. I used it to create a makeshift shelter against a large tree, securing it with some paracord I found in the old backpack. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every few minutes, I'd pause, certain I'd heard footsteps or whispers, but each time I looked, there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. With my shelter set up, I turned my attention to making a fire. The old fire pit was still usable, and I found a lighter in the backpack that miraculously still worked. Soon, I had a small blaze going, its warm light pushing back the encroaching darkness. Sitting by the fire, I tried to calm my nerves. I was lost, yes, but I had shelter and fire. In the morning, I'd be able to find my way back to the trail. Everything would be fine. A twig snapped in the darkness beyond the fire's light. I jerked my head up, peering into the gloom. "Hello?" I called again, louder this time. Is anyone out there? The whisper came again, closer now. Help us, it said, the words clearer than before. It wasn't just one voice, I realized with growing horror. It was many, layered over each other in a ghostly chorus. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding. Who's there? I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. Show yourself. The shadows seemed to move, shifting and swirling just beyond the reach of my fire. I caught glimpses of shapes that might have been human, but they were there and gone too quickly to be sure. Then, at the edge of the clearing, a figure stepped into view. My breath caught in my throat. It was the young man from the driver's license, but something was terribly wrong. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were dark, empty pools. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. More figures emerged from the forest, each as pale and hollow-eyed as the first. I recognized some of them from items I'd found in the camp. The woman with the broken glasses, the older man whose book I'd found. They formed a circle around the clearing, their unseeing eyes fixed on me. I wanted to run, to scream, but I was frozen in place. The whispers grew louder, surrounding me. Help us, they pleaded. Join us. The young man took a step forward, his hand outstretched. I could see through it like he was made of mist. Stay, he mouthed, his eyes boring into mine. That broke the spell. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush without care for direction. Branches whipped at my face, roots tried to trip me, but I kept going. The whispers followed, growing more insistent, more angry. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like lead. When I finally stopped, gasping for breath, I found myself in another small clearing. To my horror, I saw another abandoned campsite, eerily similar to the first. Spinning around, I realized I was surrounded by them. Dozens of campsites, all in various states of decay. Tents, backpacks, personal belongings scattered everywhere. And emerging from the trees around each site were more of the ghostly figures, their hollow eyes all turned towards me. The whispers rose to a fevered pitch. Join us, they insisted. Stay with us forever. I closed my eyes, willing it all to be a nightmare. When I opened them, the ghosts were closer, their misty hands reaching for me. In desperation, I reached for my phone again. To my shock, the screen lit up. One bar of signal. With shaking fingers, I dialed 911. As it rang, the ghosts drew closer, their whispers becoming screams. No, they howled. You must stay. A voice answered, blessedly human and alive. 911, what's your emergency? Help me, I cried. I'm lost in the forest, and there's something out here. Please, you have to find me. As I tried to explain where I was, the ghosts pressed in, their cold, misty forms passing through me. Each touch felt like ice in my veins, draining my energy, my will to resist. The 911 operator was saying something, but I couldn't make out the words. The phone slipped from my numb fingers as the ghosts surrounded me. Their whispers filled my head, drowning out all other thoughts. Join us, they insisted. Be part of our forest forever. I felt myself slipping away, my vision darkening at the edges. The last thing I saw was the young man's face, his empty eyes suddenly filled with a terrible hunger. A bright light cut through the darkness, momentarily blinding me. Voices, human voices, called out. Over here, we found someone. The ghosts shrieked, their forms dissipating like smoke in the wind. I felt hands on me, warm and solid, pulling me to my feet. It's okay, a gruff voice said. We've got you. You're safe now. As my vision cleared, I saw I was surrounded by park rangers. Behind them, the forest looked normal. No abandoned campsites, no ghostly figures, just trees and early morning mist. They led me out of the forest, explaining that my 911 call had led them to me. As we walked, I tried to tell them what I'd seen, but the words wouldn't come. It all seemed so impossible in the light of day. But as we reached the ranger station, I glanced back at the forest. For just a moment, I thought I saw the young man standing at the tree line, his pale hand raised in farewell. Then he was gone, leaving me to wonder if any of it had been real. One thing was certain. I would never stray from the marked trail again. Some parts of the forest, I now knew, were not meant for the living, and those who wandered into them might never truly find their way out. The first text message arrived on a Tuesday. Nice outfit. That blue really brings out your eyes. I stared at my phone, a chill running down my spine. I was wearing blue, but I didn't recognize the number. How did they know? As I would soon discover, this seemingly innocuous message was just the beginning of a nightmare that would consume my every waking moment. I'm a pretty average college student, Sarah Thompson, 21 years old, studying psychology at the local university. Nothing special, nothing that should make me a target. But apparently, someone thought otherwise. At first, I brushed off the message as a prank. Maybe one of my friends got a new number and was messing with me. I texted back a quick, "Who is this?" but got no response. I tried to put it out of my mind as I headed to my first class of the day. It wasn't until I was sitting in the campus coffee shop later that afternoon that I got the second message. "The latte looks good. You should try it with an extra shot next time." My blood ran cold. I was indeed holding a latte, and I had just been thinking about whether I should have asked for an extra shot. I looked around the busy shop, searching for any familiar faces, anyone who might be watching me. But all I saw were students buried in their laptops or chatting with friends. With shaking hands, I gathered my things and left, suddenly feeling exposed in the crowded space. As I walked back to my apartment, my phone buzzed again. "Don't forget to pick up your dry cleaning. The blue dress would look great for your presentation tomorrow." I stopped, dead in my tracks. I did have a presentation tomorrow, and I had been planning to wear my blue dress, but I hadn't told anyone about it, not even my roommate. How could this person possibly know? By the time I reached my apartment, I was in a full-blown panic. I called the police, but they were less than helpful. Without any explicit threats, they said there wasn't much they could do. They advised me to block the number and report any further incidents. I did block the number, but it didn't help. The messages kept coming, each from a different number. They knew everything: what I ate for breakfast, which route I took to class, even what song I was listening to on my headphones. "The toast was a little burnt this morning, wasn't it? You should be more careful. Taking the scenic route today? Smart choice. The flowers by the library are lovely. Dreams, by Fleetwood Mac. Classic choice. It suits your mood today." Each message sent a fresh wave of fear through me. I felt like I was losing my mind. How could someone know so much about my daily life? I started changing up my routines, taking different paths to class, varying where I ate lunch. But it didn't matter. They always knew. I became paranoid, constantly looking over my shoulder, scrutinizing every person I passed. Was it the guy always typing on his laptop in the coffee shop? The girl who lived across the hall? The friendly cashier at the campus bookstore? Everyone became a suspect. My friends noticed the change in me. I became withdrawn, jumpy. I stopped going out, preferring to stay in my apartment where I felt marginally safer. But even there, the messages found me. "The new curtains look nice. They really brighten up the room. You should really clean out your fridge. That milk is about to expire." I hadn't even noticed I was running low on milk. It was like this person was living my life alongside me, seeing everything I saw, knowing everything I knew. One night, about 2 weeks after the messages started, I woke up to my phone buzzing. The clock read 3:17 a.m. With trembling fingers, I opened the message. "You look so peaceful when you sleep." I bolted upright, my heart pounding. They were in my room. They had to be. I switched on the light, frantically searching every corner, looking under the bed, in the closet, but there was no one there. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, or the next, or the one after that. Dark circles formed under my eyes. I stopped going to classes. My grades began to slip, but I couldn't bring myself to care. All my energy was focused on trying to figure out who was doing this to me and how. I became obsessed with technology. I scoured my apartment for hidden cameras, checked my phone and laptop for spyware, even bought a signal detector to search for bugs. But I found nothing. The messages kept coming, growing more frequent and more personal. "You really should call your mom back. She's worried about you. That paper you're writing, the conclusion needs work. You're smarter than that. I know you're scared, Sarah, but I'm not here to hurt you. I just want to be close to you." That last one broke me. I couldn't take it anymore. I packed a bag and fled to my parents' and house, 2 hours away. I told them everything, showing them the messages. They were horrified, insisting I stay with them while they hired a private investigator. For a blissful 24 hours, the messages stopped. I started to hope that maybe, just maybe, it was over. But then, as I was sitting in my childhood bedroom, my phone buzzed. "Your old room hasn't changed much, has it? The teddy bear on the shelf is a nice touch. Does he still help you sleep at night?" I screamed, dropping the phone like it had burned me. My parents came running. Through tears, I showed them the message. That's when we noticed something strange. The number wasn't masked this time. It was my own phone number. The private investigator arrived the next day. He examined my phone, ran traces on the numbers, interviewed my friends and acquaintances. After a week of investigation, he came to a chilling conclusion. "There's no evidence of hacking or stalking," he said, his face grave. "As far as I can tell, these messages are coming from your phone, sent by you." I stared at him in disbelief. "That's impossible," I insisted. "I'm not sending these messages to myself." But the evidence was irrefutable. The timestamps of the messages aligned perfectly with times when my phone was active. There were no unauthorized access attempts, no malware, nothing to indicate an outside intrusion. "Have you considered," the investigator said gently, "that you might be experiencing some kind of dissociative episode, perhaps as a result of stress?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They thought I was doing this to myself, that I was crazy. But as the days wore on, and more experts were consulted, the possibility began to sink in. Could I really be the one behind all this? Was my mind fracturing under the pressure of college life, creating some kind of alternate personality that was tormenting me? I agreed to see a psychiatrist. We spent hours talking through my life, my stresses, my fears. She suggested that perhaps this stalker was a manifestation of my own anxieties, a part of myself that felt overlooked and wanted attention. It made a sick kind of sense. The stalker knew things only I could know, because it was me. The messages always seemed to voice my deepest insecurities, my hidden thoughts. Was this really just an extreme form of talking to myself? The psychiatrist started me on medication and intensive therapy. Slowly, the messages began to decrease. I started to feel more like myself again. I returned to school, caught up on my missed work, reconnected with my friends. But late at night, when I'm alone in my room, I still feel watched. I still check my phone compulsively, half expecting to see another message pop up. Because deep down, I'm not sure I believe the psychiatrist's explanation. What if it wasn't all in my head? What if there really is someone out there? Someone who found a way to make it look like I was messaging myself? Someone who's just waiting for the right moment to start again? I keep my curtains closed now. I've deleted all my social media accounts. I've even considered getting rid of my phone altogether. But I know that won't stop them. If they're real, they'll find another way to reach me. And if they're not real, if it really is just a part of my own fractured psyche, then there's nowhere I can hide. Because how do you escape from yourself? So I live each day on edge, never fully relaxed, never completely at ease. Because whether it's an external stalker or my own mind turning against me, I know one thing for certain: I'm not safe. and I may never be safe again. The messages have stopped, for now, but my phone sits on my bedside table, silent and ominous, and every night, as I try to fall asleep, I can't help but wonder, when will the next one come, and what will it say? The first thing I noticed when I walked into my apartment that night was the silence. Not the peaceful quiet of an empty home, but a heavy, oppressive stillness that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Something was wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it, but as I stood in the darkened living room, I knew that whatever had happened here while I was gone had changed everything. I'm not usually the paranoid type. As a software engineer, I spend most of my days lost in lines of code, not worrying about bumps in the night. But the events of that evening would shake me to my core and make me question everything I thought I knew about my quiet life. It had been a long day at the office, one of those frustrating slogs where nothing seems to go right. By the time I left work, it was well past 9 p.m., and all I wanted was to collapse on my couch with a beer and mindless TV. I remember thinking how nice it would be to see my neighbor, Emily, who often popped over for a chat in the evenings. She lived in the apartment next door and had become a good friend over the past few months. As I fumbled with my keys, I noticed Emily's door was slightly ajar. That was odd. Emily was meticulous about security, always double-checking her locks. I hesitated, wondering if I should check on her, but decided against it. Maybe she had just stepped out for a minute and would be right back. I pushed open my own door and stepped inside, flicking on the lights. Everything looked normal at first glance. My cluttered coffee table, the stack of unwashed dishes in the sink, my laptop still open on the desk where I'd left it that morning. But something felt off. I shrugged off my jacket and headed to the kitchen for that much-needed beer. As I passed Emily's shared wall, I heard it. A soft thud, followed by what sounded like furniture scraping across the floor. My hand froze on the fridge handle. "Emily," I called out, even though I knew she couldn't hear me through the wall. "Everything okay over there?" Silence. I pressed my ear against the wall, straining to hear more. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, suddenly, a crash. It sounded like something heavy had fallen or been thrown. My heart began to race. Should I call the police? What if Emily was hurt? Or what if it was nothing? And I ended up embarrassing myself. Before I could decide, I heard it. A scream. Muffled, but unmistakable. Emily's voice, filled with terror. I didn't think twice. I bolted out of my apartment and to Emily's door. It was still cracked open. I pushed it wider, calling out her name as I entered. The apartment was dark, but I could make out overturned furniture and scattered belongings. It looked like a struggle had taken place. "Emily," I called again, my voice shaking. "Are you here? Are you okay?" No response. I fumbled for my phone, ready to dial 911 when a floorboard creaked behind me. I whirled around, my heart in my throat. Nothing, just shadows and silence. With trembling fingers, I turned on my phone's flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing more signs of a disturbance, a broken vase, a chair lying on its side. And there, on the floor near the bedroom, a dark stain that looked horribly like blood. I swallowed hard, fighting the urge to run. Emily could be hurt. She could need help. I had to find her. Slowly, I made my way towards the bedroom, my phone held out in front of me like a shield. The door was closed. I reached for the handle, then hesitated. What if someone was in there? What if they were waiting for me? I took a deep breath and turned the knob. The bedroom was empty. The bed was unmade, clothes strewn about, but no sign of Emily. I was about to turn back when I noticed the window was open, the curtains billowing in the night breeze. I rushed over, leaning out to look. We were on the 3rd floor, much too high for someone to have climbed out. But as I peered into the darkness, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, on the fire escape, was a single red shoe, Emily's shoe. I stumbled back from the window, my mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. Things like this didn't happen in real life. Not in our quiet apartment building where the most exciting event was usually Mrs. Goldstein's overflowing bathtub leaking into the apartment below. I needed to call the police. This was way over my head. But as I raised my phone to dial, I heard another sound. This time it was coming from my own apartment. Thud, scrape, thud, scrape. The same noises I'd heard earlier, but now they were coming from my home. My breath caught in my throat. Had someone been in my apartment this whole time? Were they going through my things, waiting for me to return? I crept back to my door, which I'd left open in my rush to check on Emily. The sounds had stopped, but now I could hear something else. Breathing. Heavy, ragged breathing, like someone trying to catch their breath after a struggle. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get as far away from here as possible. But I couldn't leave, not without knowing what had happened to Emily. Gathering every ounce of courage I had, I stepped back into my apartment. The living room was as I'd left it, but the breathing was louder now. It was coming from my bedroom. I inched forward, my phone held out in front of me, its light barely penetrating the darkness ahead. As I approached my bedroom door, I noticed something on the floor, a trail of dark droplets leading from the front door to my room. My stomach churned as I realized it was blood. The breathing stopped abruptly. Whoever was in there knew I was here. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. "I've called the police. They're on their way." It was a lie, but I hoped it might scare off whoever was in there. No response. Just silence. With a trembling hand, I reached for the doorknob. It felt ice cold under my fingers. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for whatever I might find on the other side. I pushed the door open. The beam of my phone's flashlight swept across the room, revealing rumpled bedsheets, clothes scattered on the floor, and there, huddled in the corner, a figure. "Emily," I gasped. She looked up at me, her face pale and streaked with tears. Her clothes were torn, and she was cradling her arm, which was bent at an unnatural angle. "Tom," she whimpered. "He found me. Oh God, he found me." I rushed to her side, kneeling down beside her. "Who found you?" "Emily. What happened?" She shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. "My ex. He broke into my apartment. I managed to get away, climbed across the fire escape. I didn't know where else to go." I pulled out my phone, ready to call for help, but Emily grabbed my wrist. No police. He'll kill me if he finds out I told anyone." "But Emily, you're hurt. We need to get you to a hospital." She shook her head vehemently. "You don't understand. He's a cop. He'll find me. Please, you have to help me hide." My mind was reeling. This was so much bigger than I'd imagined. I was way out of my depth, but I couldn't abandon Emily. Not now. "Okay," I said, trying to sound calmer than I felt. "Okay, we'll figure this out, but first, we need to get you cleaned up." I helped Emily to her feet and led her to the bathroom. As I was wetting a washcloth to clean her cuts, I heard it, a knock at the front door. Emily froze, her eyes wide with terror. "It's him," she whispered. "He's found me." The knock came again, louder this time. Then a voice. "Police, open up." I looked at Emily, saw the panic in her eyes. If her ex really was a cop, and he really had found her here. In that moment, I made a decision that would change both our lives forever. I turned off the bathroom light and put a finger to my lips, signaling Emily to be quiet. Then I crept towards the front door. The knocking had turned to pounding now. "Open up. We know you're in there." I took a deep breath, unlocked the door, and opened it just a crack. Two uniformed officers stood in the hallway, their faces grim. "Can I help you, officers?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "We're investigating a disturbance reported in this building," one of them said. "Mind if we come in and take a look around?" I hesitated, my mind racing. If I let them in, they might find Emily. But if I refused, they'd know something was up. "Do you have a warrant?" I asked, buying time. The officers exchanged a look. "No, but then I'm afraid I can't let you in," I said, surprised by how firm my voice sounded. "If you get a warrant, come back. Until then, good night." I closed the door before they could respond, my heart pounding. I knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for now, Emily was safe. As I turned back towards the bathroom, I caught a glimpse of myself in the hallway mirror. The person staring back at me looked different, older, harder. In the space of a few hours, my quiet, predictable life had been turned upside down. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know if I was doing the right thing. But I did know one thing for certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. The first tap was so faint I almost missed it. A gentle click against the bedroom window, barely audible over the howling wind outside. I dismissed it as a branch or maybe some sleet, but then it came again. Tap, tap, deliberate, rhythmic, as if someone, or something, was trying to get my attention. That was the moment I realized this wouldn't be the peaceful winter getaway I had planned. I had rented this remote cabin for a week, desperate for some solitude after a grueling year at work. No internet, no cell service, just me, my books, and the vast snow-covered wilderness of northern Michigan. The rental agent had warned me about the isolation, especially in winter, but I had waved off her concerns. Isolation was exactly what I wanted. The cabin itself was cozy enough, a small, rustic structure with a stone fireplace, creaky wooden floors, and windows that looked out onto endless white. I had arrived that afternoon, just as the sun was setting and the first flakes of what promised to be a significant snowstorm were beginning to fall. I had spent the evening getting settled, building a fire, and losing myself in a good book. The storm picked up outside, wind rattling the windows and snow piling up on the sills. It was exactly the atmosphere I had hoped for, until that first tap. I set my book down, straining my ears. For a long moment, there was nothing but the crackle of the fire and the moan of the wind. Then, just as I was about to pick up my book again, tap, tap, tap. This time, there was no mistaking it. The sound was coming from the bedroom window. My heart rate quickened as I stood up, debating whether to investigate. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to crawl under the covers and pretend I hadn't heard anything. But curiosity, or maybe foolishness, got the better of me. I crept towards the bedroom, acutely aware of every creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. The tapping had stopped, but as I approached the window, I could swear I saw movement in the swirling snow outside. Gathering my courage, I pulled back the curtain. Nothing. Just darkness and wind-driven snow. I pressed my face close to the glass, squinting to see through the storm. For a split second, I thought I saw a shadow move across the yard, but when I blinked, it was gone. Shaking my head, I let the curtain fall back into place. I was letting my imagination run wild. It was probably just some ice or a tree branch. Nothing to worry about. I returned to the living room, determined to forget about the incident and enjoy my evening. But as I settled back into my armchair, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. The tapping didn't return that night, but I slept fitfully, jerking awake at every gust of wind or creak of the old cabin. When morning finally came, I was exhausted but relieved. In the light of day, my fears seemed silly and overblown. I made myself a strong cup of coffee and decided to survey the damage from last night's storm. Opening the front door, I was met with a wall of white. Snow had drifted up against the cabin, nearly reaching the windowsills. It was still coming down heavily, the world beyond the porch a blur of white. As I sipped my coffee, marveling at the transformed landscape, something caught my eye. There, in the snow just beyond the porch steps, was a set of footprints. My mug nearly slipped from my grasp as I stared at them, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. The prints led from the tree line straight to the cabin, circling it completely before disappearing back into the woods. They passed directly beneath the bedroom window where I'd heard the tapping. My hands shaking, I set down my mug and stepped out onto the porch for a closer look. The prints were partially filled in with fresh snow, but I could still make out their shape. They were too large to be an animal's, unless bears had suddenly started walking on two legs. No, these were unmistakably human footprints. A chill that had nothing to do with the cold ran through me. Someone had been here last night, walking around the cabin while I slept. The tapping hadn't been my imagination after all. I retreated back inside, double-checking that all the doors and windows were locked. My mind raced with possibilities. A lost hiker seeking shelter. But why not knock on the door? A thief casing the place. But what was there to steal in this remote cabin? As the day wore on, I tried to distract myself with books and puzzles, but my eyes kept drifting to the windows, searching the white expanse for any sign of movement. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and I knew I was trapped here, at least for another day or two. Night fell early, the darkness seeming to press in on the cabin from all sides. I built up the fire and turned on every light, trying to create an illusion of safety. But as the wind howled outside, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I was just considering turning in for the night when I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. This time it was coming from the living room window. My breath caught in my throat as I turned slowly towards the sound. Through a gap in the curtains, I could see a dark shape pressed against the glass. A face, distorted by frost and shadow, its features indistinct but unmistakably human. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second before the figure darted away, disappearing into the storm. I stumbled back, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. This was no trick of the light or figment of my imagination. Someone was out there, watching me, trying to get in. With trembling hands, I grabbed my phone, cursing when I remembered there was no service. The landline was just as useless, nothing but static when I picked up the receiver. I was completely cut off. The tapping started again, this time at the kitchen window, then the bathroom, then the bedroom. It was as if my unseen visitor was testing every possible entry point, looking for a way in. I grabbed the fireplace poker, clutching it like a weapon as I moved from room to room, checking locks and drawing curtains. The tapping followed me, always staying just out of sight. Sometimes it would stop for a few minutes, lulling me into a false sense of security before starting up again with renewed vigor. As the night wore on, the tapping turned to scratching, then to pounding. The whole cabin seemed to shake with the force of it. I huddled in the center of the living room, poker raised, my eyes darting from window to window. "What do you want?" I finally screamed, my voice hoarse with fear and frustration. The pounding stopped abruptly. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, so quietly, I almost missed it. A voice spoke. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, seeping through the walls like cold mist. "Let me in," it whispered. "It's so cold out here. Let me in." The voice was neither male nor female, neither young nor old. It was simply wrong. Every instinct I had screamed at me not to listen, not to give in. "Go away," I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. "Leave me alone." A low chuckle echoed through the cabin, sending shivers down my spine. "Oh, but I can't do that," the voice said. "You see, I've been alone for so long, and now you're here. We can keep each other company. Forever." The pounding resumed, louder than ever. I could hear wood splintering, glass cracking. Whatever was out there, it was going to get in, and soon. In desperation, I ran to the bedroom, slamming and locking the door behind me. I pushed the heavy oak dresser in front of it, then retreated to the far corner of the room, poker still clutched in my sweating hands. The voice continued to call to me, sometimes pleading, sometimes threatening. The pounding grew so intense I was sure the whole cabin would come down around me. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. Silence fell, broken only by my ragged breathing and the pounding of my heart. I waited, every muscle tense, for what felt like hours. But nothing happened. No more tapping, no more voice, no more pounding. As the first rays of dawn began to filter through the window, I finally allowed myself to relax, just a little. Whatever had been out there, maybe it had given up. Maybe I was safe. With the morning light came a renewed sense of determination. I had to get out of here, storm or no storm. I'd walk if I had to. Cautiously, I moved the dresser and opened the bedroom door. The cabin was a mess, furniture overturned, curtains torn, but no sign of forced entry. It was as if the horrors of the night had been nothing but a vivid nightmare. I packed my bags quickly, not bothering to clean up. I just wanted to be gone. As I opened the front door, ready to brave the snow, I stopped short. There, on the porch, was a single red mitten. I stared at it, my blood turning to ice. It hadn't been there yesterday, which meant... Slowly, I raised my eyes to the tree line. And there, just visible through the gently falling snow, was a figure. It raised a hand, waving slowly, almost mockingly. I slammed the door shut, locking it with trembling hands. As I sank to the floor, back pressed against the solid wood, a familiar sound reached my ears. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't over. It was never going to be over. And as the tapping grew louder, more insistent, I realized with dawning horror that I might never leave this cabin again. The neon sign of the motel flickered in the rain, casting an eerie red glow across the empty parking lot. I'd been driving for hours, my eyes heavy with exhaustion, when I spotted it, a beacon of hope in the middle of nowhere. Little did I know, pulling into that run-down motel would be the beginning of the most terrifying night of my life. I'd been on the road for what felt like days, making my way across the country for a new job opportunity. The monotony of highway driving had lulled me into a trance-like state, and I'd missed my intended stop for the night. Now, well past midnight, I found myself in a part of the country I didn't recognize, with no other options in sight. The Sleepy Pine Motel looked like it had seen better days. The paint was peeling, the windows were grimy, and half the letters on the vacancy sign were burnt out. But at this point, I was too tired to care. I just needed a place to crash for a few hours before hitting the road again. I pulled into the nearly empty parking lot, noticing only two other cars, an old pickup truck and a sedan that had definitely seen better days. As I cut the engine, the silence of the night enveloped me. No highway noise, no distant city sounds, just the patter of rain on my windshield and the buzzing of the neon sign. The office was dimly lit, a single bulb casting shadows across the cluttered desk. An old man sat behind it, his roomy eyes fixed on a small TV playing static. He didn't look up as I entered, the bell above the door announcing my presence. Hello? I said, approaching the desk. I'd like a room for the night, please. The old man's eyes slowly shifted from the TV to me. He didn't speak, just stared at me with an unsettling intensity. After what felt like an eternity, he reached behind him and grabbed a key off the wall. Room 7, he croaked, his voice rough as sandpaper. End of the row, $40 cash. I handed over 2 20s, trying not to show how unnerved I was. As he took the money, his fingers brushed against mine. They were ice cold. Checkout's at 10, he said, his eyes already drifting back to the static-filled TV. Don't be late. I mumbled a thank you and hurried out, key clutched tightly in my hand. The rain had picked up, and I jogged to my car to grab my overnight bag. As I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced back at the office, but the old man's eyes were still fixed on the TV. Room 7 was at the far end of the motel, separated from the other rooms by an empty space where it looked like another unit had once stood. The key stuck in the lock, and I had to jiggle it several times before the door finally swung open with a creak that set my teeth on edge. The room was about what I expected: cheap furnishings, faded wallpaper, and a musty smell that spoke of years of neglect. But it was dry, and the bed looked clean enough. I set my bag down and did a quick check of the bathroom. The tiles were cracked, and the mirror was spotted with age, but the water ran clear when I turned on the faucet. Exhaustion hit me like a wave, and I decided a quick shower could wait until morning. I changed into my sleep clothes and crawled into bed, the springs creaking under my weight. Despite my fatigue, sleep didn't come easily. The unfamiliar surroundings kept me on edge, and every little noise made me start. I must have dozed off eventually because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a loud thud. For a moment, I was disoriented, forgetting where I was. Then it all came flooding back. The long drive, the creepy motel, the unsettling old man. I lay still, listening intently. At first, there was nothing but the sound of rain against the window. Then I heard it, a muffled voice coming from the room next door. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was angry, aggressive. Another thud, louder this time, followed by what sounded like breaking glass. My heart began to race. Was someone having a fight? Should I call for help? I reached for my phone on the nightstand, only to remember there had been no signal since I'd pulled off the highway. I considered going to the office, but the thought of facing that eerie old man again made me hesitate. The voices next door grew louder. I could hear a man shouting now, his words still indistinct but his rage clear. Then, a sound that made my blood run cold, a woman's scream quickly muffled. I was out of bed in an instant, fumbling for my clothes. I had to do something. I couldn't just lie here while someone was in trouble. As I pulled on my jeans, I heard heavy footsteps outside my door. They paused for a moment, then continued past, heading towards the parking lot. Heart pounding, I crept to the window and peered out through a gap in the curtains. A man was walking briskly to the old pickup truck I'd noticed earlier. Even in the dim light, I could see dark stains on his shirt. He got in the truck and peeled out of the parking lot, tires squealing on the wet asphalt. As soon as the truck was out of sight, I grabbed the room key and rushed outside. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the night air was cold and damp. I hesitated for a moment outside the door of the room next to mine, straining to hear any sound from within. Silence. Taking a deep breath, I knocked. "Hello? Is everything okay in there?" No response. I tried the door handle, surprised to find it unlocked. The door swung open with a creak, revealing a scene of chaos. The room was trashed, furniture overturned, a lamp shattered on the floor, the bedsheet stained with what looked horribly like blood. But there was no sign of the woman I'd heard screaming. A chill ran down my spine as I surveyed the room. Something very bad had happened here, and I had a sinking feeling that the man I'd seen leaving was responsible. I needed to get help, to report what I'd seen and heard. I turned to leave, planning to wake the old man in the office and use the motel phone to call the police. But as I stepped back into the night, I froze. The parking lot, which had been nearly empty when I arrived, was now full of cars. Old cars. Vintage models that looked like they belonged in a museum rather than a seedy motel parking lot. And there, standing by my car, was the old man from the office. Only he didn't look old anymore. In the pale light of dawn, I could see that his face was smooth, unlined. He smiled at me, and his teeth gleamed unnaturally white. "Checking out so soon?" he called, his voice no longer a rasp, but rich and deep. But the fun's just getting started. I backed away, my mind reeling. This wasn't possible. None of this was possible. I turned to run, only to find my path blocked by a group of people, men and women, all dressed in clothes from another era, all wearing the same unsettling smile as the man who was no longer old. "You really should have minded your own business," a woman in a 1950s-style dress said, shaking her head sadly. "Now you'll have to join our little party." They began to close in on me, their movements unnaturally fluid. I looked around desperately for an escape route, but they had me surrounded. The last thing I saw before they reached me was the neon sign of the motel, still flickering in the early morning light. But now, Instead of Sleepy Pine Motel, it read Eternity's Rest. As hands grabbed me from all sides, a horrible realization dawned. I hadn't just checked into a motel for the night. I'd checked into something much, much worse. And I had a feeling that no matter what the sign said, checking out wasn't going to be an option. The last thing I heard before the world went dark was the old man's voice, now tinged with an otherworldly echo. Welcome to eternity, traveler. We hope you enjoy your stay. The first time I noticed something was off, it was just a coffee mug. My favorite one, the oversized ceramic monstrosity with a chipped handle, had somehow migrated from its usual spot by the sink to the center of my desk. I brushed it off as absent-mindedness, a symptom of too many late nights at the office. But as the days went by, and more items began to shift without explanation, I started to wonder if I was losing my mind, or if something far more sinister was at play in the empty halls of Crescent Tower. I'd been working the night shift at Crescent Tower for about 6 months. As a security guard for a mostly vacant office building, my job was simple: make my rounds, ensure all doors were locked, and keep an eye on the security cameras. The pay was decent, and the solitude suited me. After a messy breakup and a string of dead-end day jobs, the quiet nights gave me time to think, to plan my next move. The building itself was impressive, a gleaming skyscraper of glass and steel that dominated the city skyline. But inside, it was a ghost town. The economic downturn had hit hard, and most of the offices stood empty, waiting for tenants that never seemed to materialize. My footsteps echoed through vacant corridors, and the hum of fluorescent lights was often the only sound for hours on end. At first, I relished the peace. I'd bring books, sketch in my notebook, or just enjoy the view of the city from the top floor. But as weeks turned into months, the emptiness began to wear on me. I found myself talking out loud just to break the silence, my voice sounding strange and hollow in the deserted spaces. Then, the little things started happening. A chair slightly out of place in a conference room I knew I'd straightened the night before. A light left on in an office I was certain I'd switched off. Small, easily explainable occurrences that nonetheless left me with an uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the cleaning crew was coming in at odd hours. Maybe there were maintenance workers I hadn't been informed about. But the explanations felt hollow, especially when I checked the lobby sign-in sheet and found no record of anyone entering the building during my shifts. The coffee mug incident was the first time I couldn't ignore the strangeness anymore. I knew I hadn't brought that mug to my desk. And yet, there it sat, a silent accusation of my failing grip on reality. I began to pay closer attention, to document the changes I noticed. A potted plant moved from one side of the lobby to the other. A stack of papers rearranged on an abandoned desk. A window left open on a floor I was sure I'd secured. With each passing night, my unease grew. I found myself jumping at shadows, spinning around at the slightest sound. The vast emptiness of the building, once comforting, now felt oppressive. I could swear I heard footsteps when I knew I was alone, caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision that vanished when I turned to look. I started spending more time in the security office, eyes glued to the bank of monitors that showed feeds from cameras throughout the building. For hours, I'd watch the silent, empty halls, waiting for something, anything, to happen. And then, one night, it did. It was around 3 a.m., that dead time of night, when the world feels suspended between yesterday and tomorrow. I was on my usual rounds, flashlight beam sweeping across darkened offices, when I heard it. A soft thud, like something heavy being set down, coming from a floor above me. I froze, heart pounding. It could have been anything. The building settling, a pipe knocking, my own imagination running wild. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. This was something else. With trembling hands, I keyed my radio. Base, this is Reynolds. I'm heading up to 37 to check out a disturbance. Static crackled in response. Of course, I was base. There was no one else here. I made my way to the elevator, every nerve on high alert. As the car rose silently to the 37th floor, I tried to steady my breathing, to prepare myself for whatever I might find. The doors slid open with a soft ding that seemed obscenely loud in the silent building. I stepped out, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Everything looked normal. Desks covered in dust cloths, computer monitors dark and lifeless. And then I saw it. In the beam of my flashlight, a figure darted around a corner at the far end of the room. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice cracking. "Stop right there!" I ran after it, heart pounding in my ears. As I rounded the corner, I caught another glimpse, a dark shape, humanoid but somehow wrong, slipping into an office. I skidded to a stop outside the door, suddenly unsure. What was I doing? If this was an intruder, I was unarmed, alone, and way out of my depth. But I had to know. I had to see what had been haunting this building, haunting me, for weeks. Taking a deep breath, I pushed open the door. The office was empty. No sign of the figure I'd been chasing. No sign that anyone had been there at all. But as I swept my flashlight around the room, something caught my eye. On the desk, placed with deliberate care, was my coffee mug. The same one that had started all of this. I approached slowly, as if the mug might suddenly spring to life. As I got closer, I noticed something else. A piece of paper, folded neatly and tucked under the mug. With shaking hands, I unfolded it. The message was short, written in an elegant script that seemed to shimmer in the beam of my flashlight. "We've been watching you, James. It's time you joined us." I stumbled back, the paper falling from my numb fingers. This wasn't possible. How did they know my name? Who were they? And what did they mean? Join us. A sound behind me made me whirl around. There, in the doorway, stood a figure. It was like a shadow given form, edges blurred and shifting, but unmistakably human-shaped. As I watched, frozen in terror, more figures appeared behind it, filling the hallway. They began to move towards me, their movements fluid and unnatural. I backed away, bumping into the desk, my mind screaming at me to run, to fight, to do something. But I was rooted to the spot, unable to look away from the approaching shadows. The first figure reached out a hand, or what should have been a hand. Instead, I saw a swirling mass of darkness reaching for me. As it touched my arm, I felt a cold so intense it burned. I screamed then, the sound tearing from my throat and echoing through the empty building. The shadows paused, as if startled by the noise. In that moment of hesitation, my paralysis broke. I ran. I don't remember much of my flight from that office. It's a blur of dark corridors. The pounding of my feet on stairs, I didn't trust the elevator, and the constant feeling of pursuit. I burst out of the lobby doors, gasping for air, and ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out. When I finally stopped, I was blocks away from Crescent Tower. I turned to look back, half expecting to see a horde of shadow creatures pouring out of the building. But the street was empty, the tower looming silently against the pre-dawn sky. I never went back to Crescent Tower. I called my supervisor the next day and quit, making up some excuse about a family emergency. He didn't question it. Night guards rarely lasted long in that lonely building. Sometimes, on sleepless nights, I find myself drawn to my window, looking out at the city skyline. My eyes always find Crescent Tower, its windows dark except for the occasional flicker of movement. And I wonder about the shadows that roam its empty halls, and the invitation they extended to me. An invitation that, on my darkest days, I'm not entirely sure I should have refused. The windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the downpour as I squinted through the darkness, searching for any sign of civilization. That's when I saw him, a lone figure on the side of the road, thumb outstretched. I hesitated for just a moment before pulling over. Little did I know, that simple act of kindness would plunge me into a nightmare from which I might never wake. I'd been driving for hours, making my way cross-country for a new job opportunity. The rain had started about an hour ago, a light drizzle that quickly turned into a torrential downpour. The late-night radio DJ had been warning about flash flood advisories, but I was too far from any town to stop for the night. I just had to push through. The hitchhiker was soaked to the bone, his clothes clinging to his lanky frame. As I pulled up beside him, I could see he was younger than I'd initially thought, maybe mid-20s, with a scruffy beard and long hair plastered to his face by the rain. I rolled down the passenger window. "Hey, you need a ride?" He flashed a grateful smile, revealing a chipped front tooth. "Man, you're a lifesaver. I've been out here for hours." I unlocked the door and he clambered in, bringing with him the smell of wet clothes and something else, something earthy and pungent that I couldn't quite place. "Aye, thanks, brother," he said, shaking his head like a dog and sending water droplets flying. "I'm Jack." "Tom," I replied, pulling back onto the road. "Where are you headed, Jack?" He shrugged. "Wherever you're going is fine. I'm just trying to get out of this rain." I nodded, focusing on the road ahead. The rain hadn't let up, and visibility was getting worse by the minute. We drove in silence for a while, the only sound the rhythmic thump of the wipers and the patter of rain on the roof. "So, Tom," Jack said eventually, "what brings you out to these parts on a night like this?" I glanced at him. In the dim light from the dashboard, his eyes seemed to glint with an unnatural intensity. I shrugged off the uneasy feeling and answered, "Job interview in Phoenix. Couldn't get a flight, so I'm driving." Jack nodded slowly. "Phoenix? Huh. That's a long way from home for you, isn't it?" I frowned. "How did you know I'm not from around here?" He chuckled, a sound that sent a chill down my spine. "Just a guess. You don't seem like a local." The conversation lulled again, but the silence felt heavier now, charged with intention I couldn't explain. I tried to focus on driving, but I kept finding my eyes drawn to Jack. There was something off about him, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. "You know," Jack said suddenly, "I've always found it interesting how trusting people can be. Picking up strangers on the side of the road, letting them into their cars, their lives." I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. "Yeah, well, I couldn't just leave you out there in this weather." Jack turned to look at me, and in that moment, I swear his eyes flashed yellow in the glare of oncoming headlights. "No, I suppose you couldn't. That's not who you are, is it, Tom? Always trying to do the right thing, even when it puts you in danger." My blood ran cold. "What are you talking about? How could you possibly know that about me?" He smiled, and this time I was sure his teeth looked sharper than they had before. "Oh, Tom, I know a lot about you. I know you're running from a failed marriage back in Ohio. I know about the drinking problem you've been trying to hide. I know about the night you almost—" "Stop!" I shouted, the car swerving slightly as I lost focus. "Who the hell are you? How do you know these things?" Jack's smile widened, stretching to an impossible breadth. "I know because you let me in, Tom. Not just into your car, but into your life, into your soul." I pulled over to the side of the road, my hands shaking so badly I could barely control the wheel. "Get out," I said, my voice trembling. "Get out of my car right now." But Jack didn't move. Instead, he reached out and placed a hand on my arm. His touch was ice cold, sending waves of numbness up to my shoulder. "Oh, I'm not going anywhere, Tom. We've only just begun our journey together." I tried to pull away, but my body wouldn't respond. Panic rose in my throat as I realized I couldn't move and couldn't speak. I was trapped in my own body, powerless to do anything but watch and listen. Jack, or whatever he really was, continued speaking, his voice taking on an otherworldly echo. "You see, Tom, I've been watching you for a long time, waiting for the right moment to make contact. And tonight, when you made the choice to pick me up, you opened a door that can't be closed." He leaned in closer, and I could smell that earthy scent again, like freshly dug graves in decay. "You humans are so fascinating, so full of contradictions. You try so hard to be good, to do the right thing, but deep down, there's a darkness in all of you. And that darkness, That's where I live. I wanted to scream, to fight, to do anything, but I was helpless. Tears of frustration and fear rolled down my cheeks as Jack continued his monologue. I'm going to show you things, Tom, things you've never imagined. We're going on a journey together, you and I, a journey into the heart of your own personal hell. With that, he placed his other hand on my forehead. The world around me began to spin, colors blurring and swirling together. I felt like I was falling, plummeting into an abyss of memories and nightmares. I saw flashes of my life, the argument that ended my marriage, the nights spent drinking alone in seedy bars, the moment of weakness when I almost... No, I couldn't think about that. But the images kept coming, faster and more intense, and interwoven with my memories were visions of horror, grotesque creatures lurking in shadows, blood-soaked landscapes that defied reality, and always, Jack's face, grinning with those two sharp teeth. I don't know how long I was trapped in that nightmare kaleidoscope. It could have been minutes or days. But eventually, the visions faded, and I found myself back in my car, gasping for air. Jack was gone, but the driver's side door was open, rain pelting the interior. I was drenched, shivering, but I could move again. With trembling hands, I closed the door and turned the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered to life, and I pulled back onto the road, desperate to put as much distance between myself and this place as possible. As I drove, I tried to make sense of what had happened. Had it all been some kind of hallucination? A vivid nightmare brought on by exhaustion and stress, but I could still feel the lingering cold where Jack had touched me, could still smell that earthy, decaying scent. I drove through the night, the rain eventually giving way to a gray dawn. As the sun rose, I began to hope that maybe, just maybe, I had escaped whatever nightmare I had stumbled into. But then I glanced in the rearview mirror, and my heart stopped. There, in the back seat, was Jack. He caught my eye in the mirror and winked. "Where to next, Tom?" he asked, his voice filled with malicious glee. "We've got all the time in the world, you and I can't wait to see where this journey takes us." I wanted to scream, to slam on the brakes, to do something. But my hands remained firmly on the wheel, my foot steady on the gas pedal. I realized with growing horror that I was no longer in control. Jack, or the thing that called itself Jack, was driving now. As we sped down the empty highway towards an unknown destination, I understood the terrible truth. This wasn't the end of my nightmare. It was only the beginning. And somewhere, in the deepest recesses of my mind, I heard Jack's laughter echoing endlessly. The attic door creaked open, releasing a cloud of dust that danced in the beam of my flashlight. As the particles settled, my eyes fixed on an old trunk tucked away in the corner. I had no idea that opening that trunk would unleash a terror that would consume our lives, turning our dream home into a nightmare we couldn't escape. Sarah and I had been thrilled when we found the old Victorian house on Maple Street. It was a fixer-upper, sure, but we saw potential in its ornate woodwork and spacious rooms. The price was a steal, and we jumped at the chance to own a piece of history. We should have known that such a bargain would come with hidden costs. We'd been in the house for about a month, slowly making it our own. The previous owners had left behind a lot of junk, and we'd been sorting through it, deciding what to keep and what to toss. The attic was the last frontier, filled with dusty furniture and boxes of forgotten belongings. I'd gone up there alone that day, Sarah busy with work calls downstairs. The trunk caught my eye immediately. It was older than everything else, its leather cracked and faded, brass fittings tarnished with age. It looked like something out of a pirate movie, and I couldn't resist the urge to open it. The lock was rusted shut, but a bit of force with a crowbar popped it open. Inside, nestled among moth-eaten clothes and yellowed papers, was a stack of photographs. They were old, many of them sepia-toned or early black and white prints. I picked them up, curious about the lives captured in these faded images. As I flipped through them, a chill ran down my spine. These weren't normal family photos. Each one showed people in various states of distress. A woman crying on a street corner, a man with a look of abject terror on his face, children huddled together in what looked like an orphanage. And in each photo, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it, was a figure in the background. A tall, thin man in a dark coat, his face always turned away from the camera. I must have been up there for hours, poring over the photos, because suddenly Sarah was calling my name from downstairs. I gathered up the pictures, deciding to show them to her. Maybe she could make sense of this unsettling collection. "Alex, what have you been doing up there all this time?" Sarah asked as I came down the attic stairs. I held out the stack of photos. "You've got to see these. I found them in an old trunk." Sarah's brow furrowed as she looked through the pictures. "These are disturbing. Why would someone keep photos like this?" I shook my head. "I don't know, but look at this." I pointed out the figure in the background of one of the photos. He's in all of them, always watching. Sarah's face paled. That's creepy, Alex. Maybe we should get rid of these." But I couldn't. Something about the photos fascinated me. I spent the next few days examining them, trying to piece together their story. Who were these people? Why were they in distress? And who was the man watching them? It was about a week after finding the photos that strange things started happening in the house. At first, it was small stuff. Items moved from where we'd left them. Doors we were sure we'd closed found standing open. We brushed it off as forgetfulness, the stress of renovating an old house playing tricks on us. But then it escalated. One night, we woke to the sound of footsteps in the attic. Heavy, deliberate steps that creaked across the floorboards above our bedroom. I grabbed a baseball bat and went to investigate, but found nothing. Just the musty, empty attic, the old trunk sitting innocuously in the corner. Sarah was shaken. "Maybe it was just the house settling," she suggested, but I could hear the doubt in her voice. The incidents kept happening, becoming more frequent and more unsettling. We'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of our eyes, only to turn and find nothing there. The temperature would drop suddenly in certain rooms, our breath fogging in the air despite the summer heat outside. And always, there was the feeling of being watched. I became obsessed with the photos, convinced they held the key to understanding what was happening. I spent hours researching the locations, the clothing styles, anything that might give me a clue about their origin. Sarah grew increasingly worried about my fixation. "Alex, please," she begged one night. "Let's just get rid of them. Ever since you found those pictures, things have been wrong." But I couldn't let them go. I felt like I was on the verge of uncovering something important, something that would explain the strange occurrences in our house. It was a few nights later that Sarah woke me, her face pale with fear. "There's someone in the house," she whispered. I listened, and sure enough, I could hear footsteps downstairs. Slow, heavy steps that echoed through the old house. I grabbed the baseball bat again and crept down the stairs, Sarah close behind me. The living room was dark, but as my eyes adjusted, I saw a figure standing by the window, tall and thin, wearing a long, dark coat. My breath caught in my throat as I realized it was the man from the photos. He turned slowly, and I felt my heart stop. His face, it wasn't a face at all, just a blank, featureless expanse of pale skin. No eyes, no mouth, nothing. I heard Sarah scream behind me, but it sounded distant, muffled. The figure raised a hand, pointing directly at me, and then, in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, it spoke. "You've seen, now you're part of it." I blinked, and it was gone. The living room was empty, no sign that anyone had been there. But the feeling of being watched remained, more intense than ever. From that night on, Our lives became a waking nightmare. We'd see the figure everywhere, reflected in windows, standing at the end of hallways, always just at the edge of our vision. When we tried to look directly at it, it would vanish, only to reappear somewhere else moments later. We couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. The constant fear was wearing us down. Sarah wanted to leave, to abandon the house and never look back. But something kept me there. A need to understand, to solve the mystery of the photos and the watching man. I threw myself into research with renewed vigor, spending every waking moment trying to uncover the truth. And slowly, terrifyingly, I began to piece it together. The photos dated back over 100 years. The people in them were all connected, victims of tragedies, accidents, crimes, and the watching man. He was there for all of it, not causing the suffering, but feeding on it, gathering it like a harvest. I realized, too late, what I'd done by finding those photos. I'd invited it into our lives, given it a new hunting ground. And now, Sarah and I were its latest victims. The day I made this realization, I rushed home to tell Sarah. But when I got there, the house was empty. No sign of my wife anywhere. Just a single photograph lying on the kitchen table. A new one, showing Sarah with a look of terror on her face. And there, in the background, was the watching man. I sank to the floor, the truth crashing over me like a wave. We were part of it now, part of the collection, and the watching would never stop. As I sit here now, writing this down, I can feel its presence. It's always there, just out of sight. Waiting, watching. I know it'll come for me soon, like it came for Sarah. And then we'll be just another pair of faded photographs in an old trunk, our fear forever captured for some future victim to find. If you're reading this, if you've found the trunk and the photos, please, I beg you, don't look too closely. Don't try to understand. Just close the trunk, walk away, and never look back. Because once you've seen, once you're part of it, there's no escape. And remember, no matter where you go, no matter what you do, it will always be there, watching. The first gunshot shattered the tranquil night, echoing through the dense forest and sending a flock of startled birds into the air. In that moment, as my friends and I huddled in terrified silence behind the remains of our ransacked campsite, I realized our weekend getaway had become a fight for survival. It had started as a typical camping trip, just 4 friends looking to escape the city for a few days. Jake, my roommate from college, had suggested we explore a remote trail he'd heard about from a coworker. It's supposed to be beautiful, he'd said, eyes shining with excitement, and hardly anyone knows about it, so we'll have the place to ourselves. Sarah, my girlfriend of 2 years, was immediately on board. She was always up for an adventure, especially if it involved nature. Mark, our 4th, took some convincing. He was more of an indoor guy, but eventually, the promise of peace and quiet won him over. We set out early Friday morning, our car packed to the brim with tents, sleeping bags, and enough food to last us the weekend. The drive took us deep into the heart of the national forest, the paved road eventually giving way to a rough dirt track that tested the limits of Jake's old Subaru. By mid-afternoon, we'd reached the trailhead. It was unmarked, just as Jake's coworker had said. Nothing more than a barely visible path leading into the dense undergrowth. We shouldered our packs and set off, the excitement of exploration pushing us forward. The hike was challenging but rewarding. We climbed steep ridges that offered breathtaking views of the valley below, crossed crystal-clear streams that tumbled over moss-covered rocks, and walked through groves of ancient trees that seemed to whisper secrets in the wind. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, we started looking for a suitable campsite. That's when we stumbled upon the clearing. It was perfect. A flat, grassy area surrounded by towering pines, with a small fire pit that suggested others had camped here before. But there was something else, something that made us all pause. At the edge of the clearing stood a small cabin. It looked old, its wooden walls weathered gray by years of exposure. The windows were boarded up, and the door hung askew on rusted hinges. "I thought this area was uninhabited," Sarah said, her voice hushed. Jake shrugged, though I could see the unease in his eyes. "Maybe it's an old ranger station or something. Come on, let's set up camp. It'll be dark soon." We busied ourselves with pitching tents and gathering firewood, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every time I glanced at the cabin, I half expected to see a face peering out from behind the boards. As night fell, we huddled around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. The presence of the cabin faded to the back of our minds, replaced by the simple joy of good company and the great outdoors. It wasn't until we were preparing to turn in for the night that Mark noticed it. "Hey, guys," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "What's that on the cabin door?" We all turned to look. In the flickering firelight, I could just make out some kind of symbol carved into the wood. It looked like a circle with strange, angular lines radiating out from it. "Probably just graffiti," Jake said, but he didn't sound convinced. We tried to laugh it off, but an uneasy silence fell over the group as we retreated to our tents. I lay awake for hours, listening to the night sounds of the forest and the soft breathing of Sarah beside me. I must have dozed off eventually because the next thing I knew, I was jolting awake to the sound of twigs snapping nearby. I held my breath, straining my ears. There it was again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, circling our campsite. I shook Sarah awake, pressing a finger to my lips to keep her quiet. We peered out of the tent, and what I saw made my blood run cold. Figures moved in the darkness, their shapes indistinct but unmistakably human. They were dressed in dark clothes, and even in the dim moonlight I could see they were carrying weapons. I signaled to Sarah to stay put and quietly unzipped the tent. Jake and Mark were already awake, their faces pale with fear as they emerged from their own tent. For a moment, we just stared at each other, paralyzed with indecision. Then one of the figures spoke, his voice low and menacing. "We know you're awake. Come out now, and we won't hurt you." My mind raced. Who were these people? What did they want? I caught Jake's eye, and he nodded almost imperceptibly. In one fluid motion, we bolted, grabbing Sarah and Mark and sprinting for the cover of the trees. Shouts erupted behind us, followed by the deafening crack of gunfire. Bark splintered off a tree inches from my head, and I heard Sarah cry out in fear. We ran blindly through the forest, branches whipping at our faces, roots threatening to trip us with every step. I could hear our pursuers crashing through the undergrowth behind us, their angry voices carrying on the night air. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, we burst into another clearing, and there, looming before us in the moonlight, was another cabin. It was identical to the one at our campsite, right down to the strange symbol carved on the door. "In here," Jake gasped, already moving towards the structure. We had no choice. The sound of pursuit was growing closer, and we were exhausted and defenseless. Jake shouldered the door open, and we tumbled inside, quickly barricading it behind us. The interior of the cabin was bare save for a few broken pieces of furniture. Dust covered every surface and wall, and the air was thick with the musty smell of abandonment. "What the hell is going on?" Mark wheezed, bent over with his hands on his knees. Before anyone could answer, a voice called out from outside. "We know you're in there. There's no escape. Come out now and accept your role in the ceremony." Ceremony. The word sent a chill down my spine. I remembered the symbol on the door, and suddenly, terrifyingly, things started to click into place. "Look," Sarah whispered, pointing to the far wall. In the dim light filtering through the cracks in the boards, I could see markings covering the entire surface. Symbols, diagrams, strings of text in a language I didn't recognize. It looked like the ravings of a madman, or the blueprint for something terrible. "We have to get out of here," I said, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. But as I turned back to the door, I heard a sound that made my heart stop. the low, rhythmic chanting of many voices, growing louder by the second. Through a gap in the boards, I could see them, dozens of figures emerging from the trees, all dressed in dark robes, carrying torches that flickered in the night. They formed a circle around the cabin, their chanting reaching a fever pitch. And there, at the head of the group, stood a man. Even from a distance, I could see that his eyes gleamed with a fervent, terrifying light. "Children of the forest," he intoned, his voice carrying easily over the chanting. "The stars have aligned. The sacrifice has been chosen. Tonight, we complete the ritual that will bring about the new age." A roar went up from the crowd, and they began to advance on the cabin. I turned to my friends, saw the same terror and desperation I felt reflected in their eyes. We were trapped, with no way out and no hope of rescue. As the cultists closed in, their chanting growing to a deafening roar, I realized that our weekend getaway had become something far more sinister. We had stumbled into a nightmare, one that we might never wake up from. The door began to splinter under the force of many hands, and I knew our time was up. Whatever ceremony these people had planned, we were about to become an unwilling part of it. In that moment, as the door finally gave way and robed figures poured into the cabin, I closed my eyes and silently apologized to my friends for leading them into this. Our adventure into the wilderness had led us somewhere dark and terrifying, a place where ancient rituals and modern horror collided. And as hands grabbed us, dragging us out into the night, I knew that our ordeal was only beginning. The first knock came at midnight, a soft tapping that could have been mistaken for the house settling. But as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the sound grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't coming from the door or the windows. No, this knocking was coming from inside the walls, and it was getting closer. I'd agreed to house sit for my friend Emily without a second thought. A week in a beautiful, sprawling farmhouse in the middle of nowhere sounded like the perfect escape from my hectic city life. The old place had charm, she'd said, with its creaky floorboards and antique furnishings. What she'd failed to mention were the noises. It started small. The first couple of nights, I'd hear the occasional thump or scrape, easily dismissed as the wind or the old house shifting on its foundation. But by the third night, the sounds had taken on a rhythm, a purpose, and they always seemed to be coming from just on the other side of whatever wall I was nearest to. I tried to rationalize it. Old houses make noise, right? But there was something about the persistence of the sounds, the way they followed me from room to room, that sent chills down my spine. On the fourth night, unable to sleep, I decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight and more bravado than I actually felt, I made my way down to the basement. The stairs creaked ominously under my weight, each step echoing in the cavernous space below. The basement was a cluttered maze of forgotten furniture and dusty boxes. Cobwebs clung to every surface, and the musty smell of damp earth filled my nostrils. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, casting long shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. As I moved deeper into the basement, the knocking started again. It was louder here, more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. It seemed to be coming from behind a stack of old crates in the far corner. With trembling hands, I began to move the crates aside. The knocking grew louder, faster, as if whatever was causing it knew I was getting close. As I shifted the last crate, my flashlight illuminated something that made my blood run cold. There, set into the wall, was a door. It was small, no more than 4 feet high, its wood warped and stained with age. An ancient padlock hung from a rusted hasp, but it was what was carved into the wood that truly terrified me. Symbols, dozens of them, covered every inch of the door's surface. They looked old, their edges softened by time, but there was no mistaking their sinister nature. The knocking was coming from behind this door, growing more frantic by the second. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. This couldn't be real. What the hell had Emily gotten me into? I ran back upstairs, slamming the basement door behind me. The knocking followed, no longer confined to that hidden door, but seeming to come from every wall in the house. I retreated to the bedroom, burying myself under the covers like a child hiding from monsters. Sleep eluded me that night, and the next day I called Emily, demanding an explanation. But her phone went straight to voicemail. I left a message, trying to keep the panic out of my voice as I asked about the door in the basement and the strange noises. Hours passed with no response. The knocking had subsided during the day, but as the sun began to set, I could feel a tension building in the air. Something was going to happen tonight. I could feel it in my bones. I paced the house, checking and rechecking the locks on all the doors and windows. Not that it would matter if whatever was knocking decided to come through the walls. As darkness fell, the house seemed to come alive with sounds. Creaks and groans echoed through the empty rooms. And always, that incessant knocking. It was nearing midnight when I heard it, a new sound cutting through the cacophony. It was Emily's ringtone. My phone was ringing. I lunged for it, nearly dropping it in my haste to answer. Emily! Thank God. What the hell is going on in this house? There was a pause, and then Emily's voice came through, sounding distant and strange. I'm so sorry, Sarah. I should have told you, but I hoped it was over. What are you talking about? What's over? Another pause, longer this time. When Emily spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. The knocking. It started again, hasn't it? My blood ran cold. You knew about this, Emily. What the fuck is happening here? Listen to me carefully, Sarah. Whatever you do, do not open that door in the basement. No matter what you hear, no matter what it promises you, keep that door shut. The line went dead. I stared at the phone in disbelief, my mind reeling. Emily knew. She'd known all along, and she'd sent me here anyway. As if on cue, the knocking intensified. It was everywhere now, in every wall, under the floorboards, even seeming to come from the ceiling. And then, cutting through it all, a voice. Sarah, it called, the sound muffled but unmistakable. Sarah, please, let me out. I froze. The voice, it sounded like Emily, but that was impossible. Emily was... where? Where had she called from? Sarah, please, the voice called again. I'm trapped. You have to open the door. I pressed my hands over my ears, trying to block out the sound. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real, but the voice persisted, growing more desperate with each plea. And beneath it all, the knocking continued, a maddening rhythm that seemed to be burrowing into my brain. I don't know how long I sat there, huddled on the bed with my hands over my ears. Hours, maybe. The voice called to me, sometimes sounding like Emily, sometimes like my mother, sometimes like voices I didn't recognize, but that tugged at something deep in my subconscious. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, a new sound cut through the chaos, a key in the lock, the front door opening. Footsteps on the stairs. I tensed, ready to flee or fight. I wasn't sure which. The bedroom door swung open, and there stood Emily. She looked terrible. Her clothes were disheveled, her hair a tangled mess, but it was her eyes that truly frightened me. They were wild, filled with a mix of fear and something else. Something hungry. You didn't open it, she said, her voice hoarse. Thank God you didn't open it. Emily, I managed to croak out. What is happening? She sank to the floor, her back against the door frame. It's been in my family for generations. This house, this curse. She gestured vaguely at the walls. It wants out. It's always wanted out, and it uses us to try to free it. I shook my head, trying to make sense of her words. What is it? What's behind that door? Emily's laugh was hollow, devoid of any real humor. I don't know, nobody knows. Those who've opened the door, they're never the same, if they come back at all. A chill ran down my spine as the implications of her words sank in. You sent me here. You knew what would happen, and you sent me here anyway. She met my gaze, and I saw tears in her eyes. I thought I could end it. I thought if someone pure, someone who didn't know about the curse and could resist its call, maybe it would break the cycle. I'm so sorry, Sarah. I never should have involved you. As if on cue, the knocking started again, softer this time, but unmistakable. Emily tensed, her eyes darting around the room. We need to leave, she said, struggling to her feet. Now, before it gets stronger. I didn't need to be told twice. We fled the house, not bothering to grab any of my belongings. As we drove away, I could swear I heard a scream of frustration echoing from the walls of that old farmhouse. Emily drove us to a motel several towns over. As we sat in the shabby room, the events of the past week spinning through my mind, I turned to her. What happens now? She sighed, looking older and more tired than I'd ever seen her. I don't know. But it's not over. It's never over. As I lay in the uncomfortable motel bed that night, I couldn't shake the memory of that voice calling my name, of the symbols carved into that hidden door, and I wondered, not for the first time, what would have happened if I had given in to the temptation to open it. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again, and some knocks should never be answered. The GPS chirped, its robotic voice cutting through the silence of my car. In 500 feet, turn right. I squinted through the darkness, searching for any sign of a road. There was nothing but dense forest on either side of me. Still, I followed its instructions, turning onto what seemed to be little more than a dirt path. That's when I realized I'd made a terrible mistake, one that would plunge me into a nightmare I never could have imagined. I'd been driving for hours, making my way back home after a business trip that had dragged on far longer than expected. It was well past midnight, and the rural highways were deserted. My eyelids felt heavy, and I knew I should have stopped at a motel hours ago. But I was eager to get home, to sleep in my own bed. So I pressed on, relying heavily on my GPS to guide me through unfamiliar back roads that promised to shave an hour off my journey. The dirt road was rough, jostling me awake as my car bumped and scraped its way forward. Trees pressed in on both sides, their branches scraping against the windows. I began to doubt the wisdom of following this route, but turning around on the narrow path seemed impossible. I had no choice but to continue forward and hope the GPS knew where it was taking me. After what felt like an eternity of slow, careful driving, the trees suddenly gave way to a large clearing. In the center stood an enormous structure, an old factory, its windows dark and broken, its brick walls stained with age and neglect. The GPS chimed again. You have reached your destination. I stared at the building in disbelief. This couldn't be right. I was supposed to be on my way home, not in the middle of nowhere at an abandoned factory. I pulled out my phone to check my location, but there was no signal. The GPS screen had gone blank. Frustration and unease battled within me. I was lost, my tech had failed me, and I was sitting in front of a creepy old building in the middle of the night. I needed to turn around to find my way back to the main road. But as I put the car in reverse, the engine sputtered and died. I turned the key, once, twice, 3 times. Nothing. The car was dead. Shit, I muttered, hitting the steering wheel in frustration. I sat there for a moment, weighing my options. I could stay in the car and wait for daylight, hoping someone would come by, or I could try to find help. Neither option seemed particularly appealing. A movement in my peripheral vision made me jump. I could have sworn I saw a shadow pass by one of the factory windows. My heart began to race. Was someone there? Or was my tired mind playing tricks on me? I peered out into the darkness, straining my eyes. The factory loomed before me, silent and imposing, but then I saw it again, a flicker of movement. this time accompanied by a faint light from within the building. Someone was definitely in there. My instincts screamed at me to stay in the car, to lock the doors and wait for morning. But the rational part of my brain argued that whoever was in there might have a phone or know how to get back to the main road. Besides, it was freezing in the car, and I had no idea how long I'd be stuck here. With a deep breath, I stepped out of the car. The cold night air hit me like a slap to the face, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me. The only sound was the crunch of gravel under my feet as I approached the factory. The main entrance was chained shut, but I found a side door that yielded to a firm push. It creaked open, the sound echoing through the cavernous space beyond. I hesitated at the threshold, suddenly very aware of how foolish this was. I was walking into an abandoned building in the middle of nowhere, chasing after a light that might have been my imagination. But I was here now, and the thought of spending the night in my freezing car was enough to propel me forward. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding small and uncertain in the vast space. "Is anyone here? My car broke down, and I need help." No response, just the echo of my own voice bouncing back at me. I pulled out my phone, using its flashlight to illuminate my surroundings. The factory floor was littered with debris, broken machinery, scattered papers, empty bottles. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades. As I moved deeper into the building, I noticed something odd. Despite the overall decay, there were signs of recent activity. A clear path had been swept through the debris. Some of the machines had been cleared of dust, as if someone had been examining them. The light I'd seen from outside was nowhere to be found, but I pressed on, driven by a mixture of curiosity and the need to find help. I came to a staircase leading to an upper level and paused. Going up there seemed like an exceptionally bad idea, but I'd come this far. The steps creaked ominously under my weight as I ascended. The second floor was darker, the windows here boarded up. My phone's light seemed feeble against the pressing darkness. And then I heard it. Voices. Hushed, urgent, coming from somewhere ahead of me. Relief flooded through me. I wasn't alone here. There were people who could help me. I moved towards the sound, my footsteps quickening. I rounded a corner and froze. There, in what must have once been an office, were two men. They were hunched over a table, talking in low voices. A lantern sat between them, casting long shadows on the walls. I was about to call out to them when something made me stop. The men were dressed strangely, in dark, nondescript clothes that seemed to blend into the shadows, and spread out on the table between them was an array of objects that made my blood run cold. Guns, stacks of cash, and what looked like blueprints of some kind. I realized with dawning horror that I had stumbled onto something I was never meant to see. These weren't good Samaritans who could help me. These were dangerous men, engaged in God knows what kind of illegal activity. I began to back away slowly, praying they hadn't noticed me. But in my haste, I knocked into something behind me. A piece of metal clattered to the floor, the sound deafening in the quiet factory. The men's heads snapped up, their eyes locking onto me. For a moment, we all froze, staring at each other in shock. Then one of them shouted, "Get him!" And they both lunged towards me. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear their footsteps thundering behind me as I raced back towards the stairs. I took them two at a time, nearly falling in my haste to get down. I burst out of the stairwell onto the factory floor, frantically trying to remember which way led to the exit. Everything looked different in the dark, and in my panic, I couldn't orient myself. I could hear the men coming down the stairs behind me. One of them shouted, "Stop or we'll shoot." That only made me run faster. I dodged around machines and piles of debris, my lungs burning as I gasped for air. I had to find a way out, had to get back to my car. And then, miraculously, I saw it, the door I'd come in through. It was still slightly ajar, a sliver of night sky visible beyond it. I put on a final burst of speed, my legs feeling like jelly. I slammed into the door, bursting out into the cold night air. I didn't stop, didn't look back. I ran straight for my car, fumbling with the keys as I heard the men emerge from the factory behind me. I all but dove into the driver's seat, jamming the key into the ignition. Please start, I silently begged. The engine turned over once, twice, and then roared to life. I threw the car into drive and stomped on the gas. The tires spun in the gravel before finding purchase, and I shot forward. In my rearview mirror, I could see the two men standing in front of the factory, watching me go. One of them raised his arm, and I ducked instinctively, expecting to hear gunshots. But nothing came. I kept driving, my hand shaking on the steering wheel, until the factory disappeared from view. I drove for hours, not caring where I was going as long as it was away from there. When I finally saw signs of civilization, a 24-hour gas station on the outskirts of a small town, I nearly wept with relief. As I sat in the brightly lit parking lot, waiting for the police to arrive, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd narrowly escaped something truly terrible. My ill-advised shortcut, guided by a malfunctioning GPS, had led me into a darkness I never wanted to encounter again. To this day, I don't know what those men were planning in that abandoned factory, but whenever I see an old, decrepit building, I can't help but wonder what secrets it might be hiding. And I always double-check my route before setting out on a long drive. The first time I heard the shuffling, I dismissed it as the usual noises of apartment living. By the third night, when the sounds had grown louder and more persistent, I realized with growing dread that something was terribly wrong with my new neighbors. Little did I know, their strange behavior was just the beginning of a nightmare that would consume my entire life. I'd moved into the Cherry Grove apartments just 2 weeks ago, eager for a fresh start after a messy breakup. The place wasn't fancy, but it was clean and quiet, at least at first. My next-door neighbors, in apartment 4B, kept to themselves. I'd only caught glimpses of them, a middle-aged couple, always dressed in muted colors, their faces oddly blank. It was on my third night that I first noticed the sounds, a constant, rhythmic shuffling, like someone pacing back and forth. At first, I thought nothing of it. Everyone has their quirks, right? But as the days passed, the noises grew louder, more frantic, and they never seemed to stop. I tried to ignore it, to focus on settling into my new place and my new job. But the constant noise was wearing on me. I found myself lying awake at night, listening to the endless shuffling, wondering what could possibly be causing it. One evening, about a week after the noises started, I ran into Mrs. Patel from 4A in the hallway. She was an older woman, always ready with a smile and a bit of gossip. But today, she looked worried. "Have you noticed anything odd about the new neighbors?" she asked in a hushed tone, glancing nervously at 4B's door. I hesitated, not wanting to seem like a complainer. "Well, there have been some noises." Mrs. Patel nodded vigorously. Yes, the shuffling, all day and night. And have you seen them leave their apartment? Even once?" Now that she mentioned it, I realized I hadn't. Not in the 2 weeks since I'd moved in. "Maybe they work from home?" I suggested weakly. Mrs. Patel shook her head. No, something's not right. I've lived here for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like this." As if on cue, a loud thump came from inside 4B, followed by more intense shuffling. Mrs. Patel and I exchanged alarmed looks before hurrying to our respective apartments. That night, the noises were worse than ever. The shuffling had taken on a frenzied quality, punctuated by occasional thumps and what sounded like muffled voices. I tossed and turned, my mind conjuring up increasingly disturbing scenarios. Around 3 a.m., unable to sleep, I pressed my ear against the wall separating my apartment from 4B. The shuffling was clearer now, and I could definitely hear voices. They were speaking too low for me to make out words, but the tone was urgent, almost panicked. Suddenly, a sharp cry pierced the night, quickly muffled but unmistakably one of pain or fear. I jerked back from the wall, my heart racing. This was no longer just a nuisance. Someone could be in trouble. With shaking hands, I dialed 911. The dispatcher listened patiently as I explained the situation, but I could hear the skepticism in her voice. Noisy neighbors weren't exactly a priority. Still, she said she'd send a patrol car to check it out. I waited anxiously by my door, listening for the police. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, I heard a knock on 4B's door. Police. Open up, please. Silence, not even the usual shuffling. The knock came again, louder this time. This is the police. We've had a complaint about noise. Please open the door. More silence. I held my breath, straining to hear any response from inside the apartment. Finally, I heard the door open. A man's voice, calm and polite. Good evening, officers. Is there a problem? I couldn't hear the rest of the conversation, but it was short. Soon, I heard the police thanking the man and leaving. No more noise came from 4B for the rest of the night. The next morning, I ran into one of the officers in the lobby. Embarrassed but still concerned, I approached him. Excuse me, about last night's call to 4B. The officer smiled reassuringly. Nothing to worry about, ma'am. Just a misunderstanding. The couple in there are dealing with some health issues. The noises are related to some medical equipment. They apologized for the disturbance and promised to try to keep it down. I nodded, not entirely convinced, but not sure what else to say. As the officer left, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Medical equipment didn't explain the voices, the cry I'd heard. Over the next few days, the noises from 4B continued, but muted, as if they were trying to be quieter. I still never saw the couple leave their apartment. Packages and groceries would appear outside their door and then disappear when I wasn't looking. My curiosity and concern grew until I couldn't stand it anymore. One evening, gathering all my courage, I knocked on 4B's door. For a long moment, there was no response. Then, slowly, the door opened a crack. A man's face appeared in the gap, pale, with dark circles under his eyes. Yes? His voice was hoarse, as if from disuse. Hi, I'm your neighbor from 4A, I said, trying to sound friendly. I just wanted to introduce myself and see if you needed anything. I know you haven't been out much. The man's eyes darted nervously behind me. No, we're fine. Thank you. He started to close the door. Wait, I said, impulsively sticking my foot in the door. Are you sure? If you're having health problems, I'd be happy to pick up prescriptions or groceries. As I spoke, the door opened a bit wider, and I caught a glimpse inside the apartment. What I saw made my blood run cold. The entire living room was empty of furniture. The walls were covered in strange symbols, drawn in what looked horribly like blood. And there, in the center of the room, was a large, pulsating something. It defied description. A mass of writhing tentacles and eyes, glowing with an otherworldly light. The man saw where I was looking and let out a strangled cry. He tried to slam the door, but my foot was still in the way. We struggled for a moment, and in that struggle, the door opened wide enough for me to see more of the horror inside. The man's wife was there, but she wasn't human anymore. Her body was partially absorbed into the pulsating mass, her face frozen in a silent scream. And the mass was growing, tendrils reaching out towards the man, towards the door, towards me. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling from what I'd seen. The man took advantage of my shock to slam the door shut. I heard the lock click, followed by the sound of furniture being dragged in front of the door. I ran back to my apartment, locking the door and pushing my heaviest bookcase in front of it. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial 911. When the police arrived, they found me huddled in the corner of my living room, babbling about monsters and tentacles. They broke down the door to 4B, but found nothing. The apartment was empty, No trace of the couple, the symbols, or the horrifying creature I'd seen. They didn't believe me, of course. How could they? I barely believed it myself. But I knew what I'd seen, and I knew the horror wasn't over. In the days that followed, I couldn't sleep. Every noise made me jump. I kept seeing tentacles in the shadows, eyes watching me from dark corners. The police wrote it off as a mental breakdown, probably brought on by stress and lack of sleep. But I knew the truth. Whatever had been growing in 4B wasn't gone. It had simply moved on, found a new place to grow, to feed. And somewhere out there, in another quiet apartment building, the shuffling was starting again. I left Cherry Grove Apartments that week, unable to stay in a place where such horrors had occurred. But no matter where I go, I can't escape the memory of what I saw. And at night, in the quiet hours before dawn, I sometimes think I hear a faint, familiar shuffling growing louder with each passing day. The package arrived on a Tuesday, a plain brown box with no return address. I almost tossed it in with the junk mail, but the weight of it caught me off guard. As I turned it over in my hands, a chill ran down my spine. The label bore my neighbor's name, not mine. Little did I know that misdelivered package would drag me into a world of danger I never could have imagined. I'm not the nosy type, usually. Live and let live, that's my motto. But there was something about this package that set my nerves on edge. Maybe it was the way it was wrapped, layers of tape sealing every edge, or maybe it was the faint ticking sound I could hear when I held it to my ear. My neighbor, Mr. Reeves, wasn't home. He rarely was, always jetting off to some exotic location or another. I'd lived next door to him for 2 years and could count on one hand the number of times we'd spoken. I set the package on my kitchen counter and tried to forget about it, but as the day wore on, my curiosity grew. The ticking continued, a soft, persistent sound that seemed to fill my apartment. By evening, I couldn't take it anymore. I picked up the package and headed next door. I'd just leave it on his doorstep, I told myself. No harm, no foul. But as I approached Mr. Reeves' door, I noticed it was slightly ajar. A sliver of light spilled out into the hallway. "Mr. Reeves," I called out, knocking softly. "I've got a package for you." No answer. The door creaked open a bit wider at my touch. I should have turned around then, should have left the package and walked away. But something drew me in. The ticking from the box seemed to grow louder, more insistent. I stepped inside, my heart pounding. "Mr. Reeves, are you home?" The apartment was a mess. Papers strewn everywhere, furniture overturned. It looked like a tornado had torn through the place, or like someone had been searching for something. A noise from the bedroom made me jump. A thud, followed by a muffled curse. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. "Is someone there?" Silence, then footsteps, rushing towards me. I didn't think, just reacted. I turned and ran, still clutching the package. Behind me, I heard the sound of pursuit. Heavy breathing, the pounding of feet on the carpet. I made it to the stairwell and took the steps 2 at a time, my lungs burning. I could hear my pursuer close behind, gaining on me. I burst out of the building and into the street, nearly colliding with a group of tourists. I ducked and weaved through the crowd, not daring to look back. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I finally slowed down. My legs were shaking, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I ducked into an alley and leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath. The package was still in my hands, the ticking now a rapid tattoo against my palm. What the hell had I gotten myself into? I made my way home via a circuitous route, constantly looking over my shoulder. By the time I locked myself in my apartment, my nerves were shot. I set the package on the coffee table and stared at it. The ticking seemed louder now, more urgent. With trembling hands, I began to unwrap it. Layer after layer of brown paper fell away. Inside was a metal box, about the size of a shoebox. There was a keypad on top, glowing faintly in the dim light of my living room, and taped to the top of the box was a note. 2 sentences, typed in a stark, sans serif font. Open by midnight or the consequences will be severe. The code is your neighbor's birthday. I glanced at the clock. 11:30 p.m. 30 minutes to figure this out, or what? What consequences could be worse than what had already happened? I paced my apartment, the note clutched in my hand. Mr. Reeves' birthday. How the hell was I supposed to know that? We weren't friends. We barely spoke. 11:45 p.m. The ticking from the box was frantic now, almost desperate. I ran my hands through my hair, trying to think. Wait, the building, the tenant information form we all had to fill out when we moved in. It asked for our birth date, and I remembered seeing a copy of it on the superintendent's desk when I went to complain about a leaky faucet last month. I bolted from my apartment and down to the super's office in the basement. The door was locked, of course. I looked around frantically, then grabbed a fire extinguisher from the wall. The sound of breaking glass echoed through the empty hallway. I climbed through the window, wincing as broken glass cut my hands. The office was dark, but I found the file cabinet easily enough. My hands shook as I flipped through the folders. Reeves, Allen, there it was. I pulled out the form, my eyes scanning for the birth date, 11:55 p.m. I raced back upstairs, the form clutched in my bleeding hand. I punched in the numbers on the keypad, 05, 17 to 62. The ticking stopped. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a soft click, the box opened. Inside was money. More money than I'd ever seen in my life. Stacks and stacks of $100 bills. And nestled among the cash was a small black flash drive. I stared at the contents of the box, my mind reeling. What was going on? Who had been chasing me? And what was on that flash drive? Before I could decide what to do, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Good job. Now the real work begins. Instructions to follow. Tell no one if you want to live. I sank onto my couch, the open box in front of me, my phone clutched in my shaking hand. What had I gotten myself into? The next few days were a blur. More texts arrived, each with a new set of instructions. Go to this address. Leave the flash drive in a specific location. Pick up another package. Each task completed earned me more money, delivered in the same ticking boxes. I didn't know what I was involved in, but I knew it was dangerous. I saw men in dark suits watching me from parked cars. Once, I'm sure I spotted Mr. Reeves across a crowded street, but when I tried to approach him, he vanished into the crowd. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every sound made me jump. I was trapped in a world I didn't understand, carrying out tasks for people I'd never met, all the while waiting for the other shoe to drop. It was a week into this nightmare when things finally came to a head. The text came in just after midnight. Final task. Come to the address below. Bring everything. I knew this was it. Whatever I'd been caught up in was coming to an end, one way or another. The address led me to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. As I approached, carrying a duffel bag filled with cash and flash drives, I saw a figure standing in the shadows of the loading dock. Mr. Reeves stepped into the light. He looked different, thinner, more haggard. His eyes darted nervously from side to side. "You've done well," he said, his voice hoarse. "Better than I expected." "What is all this?" I demanded. "What have you gotten me involved in?" He smiled, but there was no humor in it. International espionage, corporate sabotage, government secrets. Take your pick. The contents of those drives could topple empires. I felt sick. Why me? Why drag me into this? "Because you were nobody," he said simply. "No connections, no suspicions, the perfect courier." Before I could respond, headlights flooded the area. Cars screeched to a halt around us, and men in dark suits poured out, guns drawn. "FBI, freeze!" Everything happened so fast after that. Mr. Reeves tried to run but was quickly tackled. I stood there, hands raised, as agents swarmed around me. Hours of interrogation followed. I told them everything, from the first package to the final text. They seemed to believe I was an unwitting pawn, but I could tell my life would never be the same. As dawn broke, a stern-faced agent sat across from me. "We've got a proposition for you," he said. "Your neighbor was part of a much larger organization. We need someone on the inside, someone they already trust." I stared at him, realization dawning. "You want me to be a spy?" He nodded. "It's that, or face charges as an accomplice. Your choice." In that moment, I realized the normal life I'd known was gone forever, all because of a misdelivered package and my own cursed curiosity. I took a deep breath and made my choice. "Where do I start?" The agent smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Welcome to the world of shadows," he said. "Try not to get lost in the dark." As I followed him out of the interrogation room, I couldn't help but think about how a simple package had completely upended my life. I was stepping into a world of secrets and danger, all because I couldn't resist the mystery of a ticking box. The ordinary man I'd been was gone. In his place stood someone new, someone who now knew that the line between everyday life and international intrigue was thinner than he'd ever imagined. And as I walked into my new life, I realized that the real adventure and the real danger was only just beginning. The first twig snapped under my boot with a crack that echoed through the silent forest. I froze, suddenly aware of how alone I was. The dense canopy above had swallowed the sunlight, leaving me in a world of shadows and whispers. As I stood there, heart pounding, a chilling realization crept over me. I had no idea which direction I had come from, or how to get back to the trail. Little did I know, getting lost was about to become the least of my worries. I'd set out early that morning, eager to tackle one of the more challenging hiking trails in the state park. I was an experienced hiker, or so I thought, and the idea of a solo trek through pristine wilderness had been irresistible. The first few hours had been exhilarating. The crisp autumn air, the vibrant colors of changing leaves, the sense of being truly alone with nature. But as the day wore on, things started to feel off. The trail markers became less frequent, then disappeared entirely. The familiar sounds of birds and small animals faded away, replaced by an oppressive silence. And now, as I stood in a clearing I didn't recognize, I had to admit the truth. I was hopelessly lost. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing thoughts. "Don't panic," I muttered to myself. "You've got supplies. You've got daylight. Just retrace your steps." But as I turned to head back the way I thought I'd come, something caught my eye. There, just at the edge of the clearing, was a flash of movement. I squinted, trying to make out what it was. A deer, maybe, or a bear. Whatever it was gone before I could get a good look. But the encounter left me with an uneasy feeling. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched. I picked up my pace, pushing through the underbrush, determined to find my way back to a marked trail. But with each step, the forest seemed to grow denser, the shadows deeper. The trees loomed overhead, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. After what felt like hours of walking, I stumbled into another clearing. My heart sank as I realized it was the same one I'd left earlier. Somehow, I'd gone in a complete circle. "This is impossible," I said aloud, my voice sounding strange and muffled in the still air. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural sound that was definitely not made by any animal I knew. It came from behind me, and I whirled around, my heart pounding in my chest. Nothing, just more trees, more shadows. But as I stared into the gloom, I could have sworn I saw something move, a dark shape, just on the edge of my vision, darting between the trees. Panic seized me and I ran. I crashed through the forest, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. I had no idea where I was going, only that I needed to get away from whatever that thing was. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like jelly. Finally, gasping for breath, I slumped against a large oak tree. As my breathing slowed, I realized with growing horror that I could hear something moving in the forest around me. Soft footsteps, the rustle of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig. It was circling me. I closed my eyes, praying that this was all just a bad dream, that I'd open them and find myself back in my tent, safe and sound. But when I looked again, the forest was still there, as dark and menacing as ever. And now, I could see them. Eyes, gleaming in the shadows. Dozens of them, watching me from all directions. They didn't look like any animal eyes I'd ever seen. They were too intelligent, too hungry. I fumbled for my phone, desperate for any connection to the outside world. But of course, there was no signal. I was on my own. As the day wore on and the light began to fade, my situation grew more desperate. I tried to build a fire, hoping the light and warmth would keep the things at bay. But every time I got close to getting a spark, a gust of wind would come from nowhere, extinguishing my efforts. The eyes never left, always watching, always waiting. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of shapes moving just out of sight, tall, elongated forms that seemed to shift and change as I looked at them. Night fell, plunging the forest into near-total darkness. The only light came from the moon, its pale glow filtering through the leaves to cast eerie shadows on the forest floor. The eyes seemed to glow brighter in the dark, and the noises grew bolder. Whispers that almost sounded like words, but in no language I'd ever heard. I huddled at the base of a large tree, my back pressed against its rough bark, my knife clutched in my shaking hands. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear movement nearby, snapping them open to see those glowing eyes even closer. As the night wore on, I began to doubt my own sanity. Was any of this real? Or had I fallen and hit my head, and this was all some kind of twisted hallucination? Just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, I heard a new sound. A voice, calling my name. Jack. Jack. Where are you, Jack? It sounded like my mother, but that was impossible. She was hundreds of miles away, safe at home. Mom, I called out, my voice cracking. Jack, honey, come here. You're lost. Let me help you. Her voice was coming from the darkness beyond the trees. Every instinct screamed at me not to go, that this was a trick, but it sounded so real, so comforting. I took a step towards the voice, then another. As I moved deeper into the shadows, the eyes seemed to recede, giving me a clear path. That's it, sweetie. Just a little further. I pushed through a dense thicket, branches scratching at my arms. And then I saw her, my mother, standing in a small clearing, her arms outstretched. Relief flooded through me, and I rushed towards her. But as I got closer, I realized something was wrong. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, and her eyes were just like the ones I'd seen in the forest, glowing, hungry. I skidded to a stop, my relief turning to horror. The thing that looked like my mother smiled, its mouth opening far wider than any human mouth should. What's wrong, Jack? Don't you want to give your mother a hug? I turned and ran, crashing back through the thicket, branches tearing at my clothes and skin. Behind me, I could hear something in pursuit. The sound of snapping branches and heavy breathing grew closer with each passing second. I ran blindly, no longer caring about finding my way back, focused only on escaping the horrors that lurked in the dark. My foot caught on a root, and I went down hard, tumbling down a steep embankment. I came to rest at the bottom, dazed and battered. As I struggled to my feet, I realized I was standing on something hard and flat. Asphalt. A road. Hope surged through me. A road meant people, civilization, safety. I picked a direction at random and started jogging, my tired legs protesting with every step. After what felt like miles, I saw headlights in the distance. I waved my arms frantically, and to my immense relief, the car slowed to a stop beside me. An older man rolled down his window, concern etched on his face. "You all right, son? You look like you've been through hell." I opened my mouth to respond, to tell him about the horrors I'd experienced in the forest. But as I turned to point back the way I'd come, I froze. The forest was gone. In its place was an open field, bathed in early morning sunlight. No dark trees, no glowing eyes, no monstrous shapes, just peaceful, normal countryside. I turned back to the man, my mind reeling. I got lost," I managed to stammer. "Can you give me a ride to the nearest town?" As we drove away, I couldn't stop looking back at that field. Had it all been in my imagination? A hallucination brought on by fear and exhaustion? Or had I stumbled into something ancient and terrifying, something that existed just on the edges of our world? I never went hiking alone again after that night. And to this day, when I'm in the woods and the shadows grow long, I can't shake the feeling that something is watching me from just beyond the trees. Waiting. Hungry. Ready to lure me off the path and into a darkness from which there might be no return. The security camera footage shouldn't have shown anything. The facility was locked down tight, every door secured, every alarm set. But there it was, a shadowy figure, moving through solid walls as if they were made of smoke. That was the moment I realized this night shift job was going to be anything but ordinary. I'd taken the position at Secure Store Storage about a month ago. The pay was decent, and the job seemed simple enough. Monitor the cameras, make hourly rounds, and ensure nothing out of the ordinary happened. For the most part, it was mind-numbingly boring, but that suited me just fine. After a string of high-stress jobs that had left me burnt out, I was ready for some peace and quiet. The facility itself was massive, a sprawling complex of climate-controlled units housing everything from family heirlooms to corporate archives. My post was in a small security office near the main entrance aiding, surrounded by banks of monitors showing feeds from the hundreds of cameras scattered throughout the building. That night started like any other. I arrived for my shift at 10 p.m., relieved the day guard, and settled in for another uneventful night of staring at screens and drinking too much coffee. The first few hours passed without incident. I made my rounds, checking locks and ensuring all was secure. It was around 2 a.m. when I first noticed something odd. I was doing my routine scan of the camera feeds when movement on one of the screens caught my eye. It was in one of the long corridors on the third floor, a flicker of shadow that seemed to dart from one storage unit to another. I leaned in closer, frowning. Probably just a trick of the light, I thought. But as I watched, I saw it again. A dark shape, moving with purpose down the hallway. It paused in front of a unit, seemed to consider for a moment, then passed right through the door. I blinked hard. Sure, I must be seeing things. People can't walk through solid metal doors. I rewound the footage, watching it again and again. There was no mistaking it. The figure had definitely phased through the door as if it wasn't even there. My heart was pounding now, a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. This was impossible. I had to be hallucinating, or maybe someone was playing an elaborate prank. I grabbed my flashlight and radio, determined to investigate. The third floor was eerily quiet as I stepped out of the elevator. The long rows of storage units stretched out before me, bathed in the dim glow of emergency lighting. I moved cautiously down the corridor, my flashlight beam sweeping back and forth. As I approached the unit where I'd seen the figure disappear, I noticed something strange. The lock was intact, showing no signs of tampering, but there was a faint, smoky smell in the air, like ozone after a lightning strike. I keyed my radio. "Base, this is Johnson. I'm on the third floor investigating a possible intrusion. No signs of forced entry, but something's not right here." Static crackled in response. I frowned, tapping the radio. It had been working fine earlier. That's when I heard it. A soft scraping sound coming from inside the unit. I froze, my flashlight trained on the door. The scraping grew louder, more insistent. Then, to my horror, a hand began to emerge from the solid metal door. It was followed by an arm, a shoulder, and finally, a whole figure stepped out into the hallway. I stumbled backward, my mouth open in a silent scream. The figure was human-shaped but seemed to be made of shifting shadows. Where its face should have been was just a swirling void. It turned towards me, and though it had no eyes, I could feel its gaze boring into me. A voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once filled my head. "You shouldn't be here," it said, the words reverberating through my skull. "This doesn't concern you." I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything, but I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear and disbelief. The shadow figure moved towards me, each step soundless on the concrete floor. What are you?" I managed to stammer. The figure tilted its head, considering. "We are the keepers," it said. "We guard what must remain hidden. And you, human, have seen too much." It reached out a smoky hand towards my face. I felt a cold so intense it burned, and then darkness. I woke up back in the security office, slumped over in my chair. The monitors showed nothing but empty hallways. I checked my watch. 6 a.m. My shift was almost over. Had it all been a dream? Some kind of stress-induced hallucination? I rubbed my eyes, trying to make sense of what had happened. But as I stood up, something fell from my lap. A small, black feather, unlike any I'd ever seen before. Over the next few weeks, I tried to convince myself that nothing had happened. I went about my shifts as usual, telling myself that the incident had been a product of an overactive imagination and too much caffeine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had fundamentally changed. I started noticing things, items in storage units rearranged between my rounds, shadows that moved when they shouldn't, and sometimes, late at night when the facility was at its quietest, I could swear I heard whispers in a language I didn't understand. I tried to talk to my coworkers about it, but they just laughed it off. "This place'll play tricks on your mind if you let it," the day guard told me with a wink. Best not to think too hard about it. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. I became obsessed, spending my off hours researching the history of the building, looking for any clues about what the keepers might be. I found nothing concrete, but there were whispers, urban legends about strange occurrences at storage facilities across the country, people reporting lost time, items mysteriously appearing or disappearing, shadowy figures seen out of the corner of the eye. One night, about a month after my encounter, I decided to take action. I smuggled in a small camera, determined to catch evidence of whatever was going on. I set it up in the corridor where I'd first seen the shadow figure and waited. For hours, nothing happened. I was beginning to think I'd imagined the whole thing when suddenly, the camera's feed went dark. Not just dark, it was as if the lens had been covered by something. And then, slowly, a face began to emerge from the darkness. It was the shadow figure, staring directly into the camera. "We warned you." Its voice echoed in my head. "Now you must choose, join us, or forget." The camera exploded in a shower of sparks, making me jump. When I looked back at the monitor, the figure was gone. I sat there for a long time, my mind reeling. Join them, forget, what did that mean? And more importantly, what would happen if I refused both options? As dawn broke, I made my decision. I couldn't live like this, constantly looking over my shoulder, questioning my sanity. I wrote out my resignation, left it on my supervisor's desk, and walked out of secure store storage for the last time. Or so I thought. 2 days later, I woke up back in the security office, starting another night shift. My resignation letter was gone, and my supervisor had no memory of me quitting. In fact, no one seemed to remember anything out of the ordinary happening. But I remembered, and I knew that my choice had been made for me. I was part of whatever secret secure store was keeping now, whether I liked it or not. These days, I go about my shifts with a newfound awareness. I've learned to recognize the signs of the keeper's presence, the faint smell of ozone, the sudden drop in temperature, the flicker of movement just at the edge of vision. Sometimes, late at night, I catch glimpses of them moving through walls or rearranging items in the units. But I've learned not to look too closely, not to question too much, because now I understand the truth. Some things are meant to stay locked away, hidden from the world. And here at Secure Store, we're not just guarding people's possessions, we're guarding secrets that could shatter reality itself. So if you ever find yourself needing a storage unit, and you happen to choose Secure Store, just remember, some doors are meant to stay closed, eh? And if you hear whispers in the night or see shadows moving where they shouldn't, well, it's probably best to just look the other way. Trust me, I know from experience. After all, I'm not just a night guard anymore. I'm a keeper now, too. And some secrets are worth keeping, no matter the cost. The first cough was easy to dismiss. The second raised an eyebrow, but when Sarah started coughing up blood, I knew we had unleashed something far more sinister than dust from our home renovation. The sealed room we discovered in our century-old house wasn't just a quirk of architecture. It was a tomb of horrors that should have remained buried. We'd been so excited when we bought the old Victorian on Maple Street. Sarah and I had always dreamed of restoring a historic home, and this one seemed perfect. Sure, it needed work, but we saw potential in its ornate woodwork and spacious rooms. The price was surprisingly low for the neighborhood, which should have been our first warning. But we were too caught up in the romance of it all to notice the red flags. The first few weeks were a whirlwind of cleaning and minor repairs. We tackled the easy stuff first: fresh paint, refinished floors, updated electrical. It wasn't until we started on the major structural work that things took a turn. I was in the basement, mapping out where we'd need to shore up the foundation, when I noticed something odd about one of the walls. It didn't quite line up with the floor above. Curious, I tapped along its length, listening for hollow spots. About halfway down, the sound changed. I pressed harder, and to my surprise, a small section of the wall swung inward. Heart pounding with excitement, I called for Sarah. "Honey, you've got to see this. I think I found a hidden room." She came running down the stairs, her eyes wide with curiosity. Together, we pushed the secret door open wider, revealing a space about the size of a large closet. The air that rushed out was stale and carried a sickly sweet odor that made us both gag. As our eyes adjusted to the gloom, we saw that the room was filled with shelves. And on those shelves were jars, dozens of them, filled with murky liquid in shapes we couldn't quite make out. In the center of the room stood an old examining table, its surface stained with dark patches. "What is this place?" Sarah whispered, her voice tight with unease. I shook my head, at a loss for words. It looked like something out of a mad scientist's lair or a Victorian-era medical horror show. Against my better judgment, I stepped into the room for a closer look. The jars contained specimens, organs, tumors, things I couldn't even identify. Scattered among them were old medical instruments, their metal dulled with age but still wickedly sharp. In one corner, a bookshelf held leather-bound volumes. I pulled one out, coughing at the cloud of dust it released. The title, stamped in faded gold leaf, read, "Experimental Procedures in Human Enhancement." "Alex, I don't like this," Sarah said from the doorway. "We should seal it back up and pretend we never found it." I knew she was right, but curiosity got the better of me. "Let's just take a quick look through some of these books. Maybe we can figure out what this place was used for." That decision would haunt me for the rest of my life. Over the next few days, we spent hours in that room, poring over the old texts and examining the specimens. The books detailed horrific experiments, attempts to push the boundaries of human physiology through surgical and chemical means. Many of the procedures described made my stomach turn, but I couldn't stop reading. Sarah was less enthusiastic. She complained of headaches and nausea, which we attributed to the dust and the disturbing nature of what we were uncovering. But as the days wore on, her symptoms worsened. It started with a persistent cough that kept her up at night. Then came the fever, low grade at first, but steadily climbing. I wanted to take her to the doctor, but she insisted it was just a bad cold. A week after we discovered the hidden room, I woke to the sound of Sarah retching in the bathroom. When I rushed to check on her, I found her hunched over the toilet, coughing up blood. "That's it," I said, helping her to her feet. "We're going to the hospital. Now." The emergency room was a blur of tests and worried doctors. Sarah's condition baffled them. Her white blood cell count was through the roof, but they couldn't identify the infection. Her lungs showed signs of severe irritation, but there was no apparent cause. As I sat by her hospital bed, watching her struggle for each breath, a terrible realization began to dawn on me. The hidden room, the experiments, Sarah's mysterious illness, they had to be connected. I raced home, determined to find answers in the old medical texts. As I flipped through page after page of gruesome experiments, I found a section on airborne pathogens. The researcher, whose name had been carefully obscured, wrote about creating a supreme illness that would target the respiratory system and bloodstream simultaneously. My blood ran cold as I read the symptoms. They matched Sarah's exactly. I grabbed as many books as I could carry and rushed back to the hospital. The doctors were skeptical at first, but as I showed them passage after passage describing Sarah's exact condition, they began to take me seriously. "This is unlike anything I've ever seen," the lead physician said, frowning at the old text. "If this is accurate, your wife has been exposed to a pathogen that was engineered over a century ago. I'm not sure our modern treatments will be effective." The next few days were a nightmare of experimental treatments and anxious waiting. Sarah's condition continued to deteriorate. Her skin took on a grayish pallor, and dark veins stood out in stark contrast. She drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes screaming about shadows in the corners of her room. I never left her side, poring over the old books, desperate for any clue that might save her. On the third night, as I was about to give up hope, I found it, a formula for an antidote, scribbled in the margins of one of the texts. The ingredients were bizarre, a mix of common herbs and exotic compounds I'd never heard of. But at that point, I was willing to try anything. I presented the formula to Sarah's doctors. They were hesitant, warning me about the risks of using an untested treatment from a century-old book. But as Sarah's vitals continued to drop, they agreed it was worth a shot. The hospital pharmacist worked through the night, combining the strange ingredients according to the ancient recipe. As dawn broke, they administered the first dose. For hours, nothing seemed to change. Sarah's fever raged on, her breathing labored and painful. I held her hand, silently begging whatever powers might be listening to save her. And then, slowly, miraculously, her fever began to break. Her breathing eased. The gray tint to her skin faded. Over the next few days, Sarah's recovery astonished her medical team. The mysterious pathogen that had ravaged her body seemed to vanish without a trace. A week after we administered the antidote, she was well enough to come home. But our ordeal was far from over. As Sarah regained her strength, she began to change in subtle ways. Her reflexes became preternaturally quick. Her mind seemed sharper, processing information at an incredible speed. And sometimes, when she thought I wasn't looking, I could swear her eyes flickered with an otherworldly light. We sealed up the hidden room, pouring concrete over the entrance to ensure it would never be opened again. We told ourselves we'd put the whole nightmare behind us, but deep down, we both knew that whatever had been unleashed from that room had changed us forever. Sarah's enhanced abilities grew stronger with each passing day. At first, we saw it as a silver lining to our horrific experience, but as weeks turned to months, I began to worry. What if the changes didn't stop? What if the human enhancement experiments detailed in those old books had finally succeeded, a century later? We don't talk about the hidden room anymore, We've settled into a new normal, pretending that our lives haven't been irrevocably altered. But sometimes, late at night, I catch Sarah staring at her reflection, a mixture of wonder and fear in her eyes. And I can't help but wonder, what else might be hidden in the walls of our home? What other horrors from the past are waiting to be unleashed? One thing's for certain, some doors are meant to stay closed, some secrets are meant to remain buried, and sometimes the quest for knowledge comes at a price too high to pay. As I watch Sarah grow stronger, faster, and more brilliant each day, I can't shake the feeling that we've only scratched the surface of the terror lurking beneath our feet. And I fear that one day, the full consequences of our discovery will come to light, changing not just our lives, but the very fabric of the world around us. The moment I stepped into the apartment, I knew something was terribly wrong. The furniture was all different, the walls a color I'd never seen before, and the air thick with a scent that didn't belong. But the key had worked, and my things were still there, scattered among items I'd never seen before. In that instant, I realized I had stumbled into a nightmare that defied all logic and reason. I'd been house-sitting for my friend, Emily, while she was away on a 2-week business trip to Tokyo. It was a simple enough arrangement: water her plants, feed her cat, and make sure nothing caught fire. The apartment was in a nice part of town, much fancier than my own place, and I'd been enjoying the chance to live somewhere a bit more upscale, if only temporarily. Everything had been normal for the first week and a half. I'd settled into a routine, working from the apartment during the day and enjoying the big screen TV and comfortable couch in the evenings. Emily's cat, Mr. Whiskers, had even warmed up to me, curling up on my lap as I watched late-night reruns. But then came that fateful morning. I'd gone out for a quick coffee run, nothing unusual. I was gone for maybe 20 minutes, tops. When I returned, I inserted the key into the lock, heard the familiar click, and pushed the door open. The first thing that hit me was the smell. Emily's apartment always had a faint scent of lavender, thanks to her fondness for scented candles. But now the air was heavy with the scent of cinnamon, and something else I couldn't quite place. Spicy, almost medicinal. I blinked, convinced for a moment that I'd somehow entered the wrong apartment. But no, this was definitely the right floor, the right door number. And there, on the coffee table, was my laptop, right where I'd left it. But the coffee table wasn't the same. Instead of Emily's sleek, modern glass table, my computer sat on a heavy, ornate wooden piece that looked like an antique. The couch behind it was no longer the plush gray sectional I'd been lounging on for days, but a floral-patterned monstrosity that looked like it belonged in an elderly woman's living room. "What the hell?" I muttered, taking a few hesitant steps into the apartment. The walls, which had been a soft beige, were now a deep burgundy. Heavy curtains hung over the windows, blocking most of the natural light. The whole place felt darker, more closed in. I spun around, my heart pounding. This had to be some kind of elaborate prank. Maybe Emily had come home early and decided to play a trick on me, but even as I had the thought, I knew it was impossible. There's no way anyone could have completely redecorated an apartment in 20 minutes. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking slightly. "Is anyone here?" No response, just the tick of an old grandfather clock that definitely hadn't been there before. I moved further into the apartment, my eyes darting from one unfamiliar item to the next. Emily's modern art prints had been replaced with oil paintings in heavy gilt frames. The sleek kitchen appliances were now vintage models that looked like they were from the 1950s. But among all these strange, new items, I kept spotting things that belonged to me. My jacket hung on an unfamiliar coat rack. My book lay on a side table I'd never seen before. It was as if my possessions had been scattered throughout this bizarre, alternate version of Emily's apartment. I pulled out my phone, intending to call Emily or maybe even the police, but there was no signal. The Wi-Fi wasn't working either. I was cut off. That's when I heard it. A soft meow from the bedroom. Mr. Whiskers. With a sense of relief, I rushed to the bedroom door. At least the cat was still here. Something familiar in this sea of strangeness. I pushed open the door and froze. The bedroom had changed too. The modern platform bed was gone, replaced by a huge four-poster monstrosity draped in heavy velvet curtains. But it wasn't the bed that stopped me in my tracks. There, sitting primly on the edge of the mattress, was a cat. But it wasn't Mr. Whiskers. This cat was massive, easily 3 times the size of Emily's pet, with long, silky black fur and eyes that glowed an unnatural shade of green. The cat tilted its head, regarding me with an intelligence that seemed far too human. And then, to my utter disbelief, it spoke. "You're early," it said, its voice a deep, resonant purr. "We weren't expecting you for another hour at least." I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. Cats don't talk. Apartments don't spontaneously redecorate themselves. None of this was possible. I don't understand," I stammered. "What's going on? Where's Mr. Whiskers? Where's Emily's stuff?" The cat stretched languidly, seeming unconcerned by my panic. "Mr. Whiskers? Oh, you mean the small one. He's around here somewhere. Probably hiding. He's not very brave, that one." I shook my head, trying to clear it. Maybe I was dreaming, or having some kind of mental breakdown. That had to be it. The cat hopped down from the bed and padded towards me. "You really don't know what's happening, do you?" it asked, sounding almost sympathetic. "Sit down, dear. You look like you're about to faint." In a daze, I sank onto an unfamiliar armchair. The cat leapt up onto the arm, its tail swishing back and forth as it studied me. "Let me explain," it said. "This apartment exists in multiple realities. Usually, the shift happens when no one's here to notice. But sometimes things don't quite line up. You've stumbled into a different version of your friend's home. A version from a reality where things are a bit different." I stared at the cat, trying to process its words. Multiple realities, shifts. It sounded like something out of a sci-fi novel. That's impossible," I said weakly. The cat made a sound that might have been a laugh. "My dear, you're talking to a cat. I think we're well past impossible, don't you?" It had a point. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing thoughts. "Okay," I said slowly. "Let's say I believe you. How do I get back? To my reality, I mean." The cat's ears twitched. Well, that's the tricky part. The shifts aren't exactly predictable. It could be minutes, hours, or..." It paused, glancing away. "Or longer." "Longer," I echoed, a new wave of panic rising. "How much longer? I can't stay here. I have a life, a job. People will wonder where I am." "Time moves differently between realities," the cat said softly. "When you return to your world, it's likely that very little time will have passed. But I won't lie to you. I've seen people trapped here for what felt like years to them." The room seemed to spin around me. Years? I could be stuck in this strange, alternate version of Emily's apartment for years. "There has to be a way back," I insisted. "Some way to control it." The cat tilted its head, considering. "There are methods, but they're dangerous, unpredictable. You might end up somewhere even further from your reality." I stood up, pacing the unfamiliar room. "I'll risk it. I can't just sit here and wait. What do I need to do?" The cat watched me for a long moment, its eerie green eyes unblinking. Finally, it sighed. "Very well. But remember, I warned you. The process involves a series of tasks, each designed to attune you to the energies of different realities. If you complete them successfully, you should be able to guide yourself back to your world." Over the next few hours, or was it days, time seemed to move strangely here. The cat guided me through a series of bizarre rituals. I drew complex symbols on the walls with crushed herbs, chanted in languages I'd never heard before, and even had to catch and release a spectral mouse that phased through the walls. All the while, the apartment kept changing subtly around us. Sometimes I'd turn around and the furniture would be completely different. Once, I looked out the window and saw a sky filled with 3 moons. Through it all, the cat remained my constant companion, offering guidance and warnings in equal measure. I learned that its name was Kronos, and that it had been guiding lost travelers between realities for centuries. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Kronos announced that I was ready for the final step. "Remember," it said gravely, "focus on your reality. Picture it clearly in your mind. Any doubt, any stray thought, and you could end up anywhere." I nodded, closing my eyes. I thought of Emily's apartment as I'd first seen it, of Mr. Whiskers, of the life I'd left behind. In my mind, I reached out, feeling for the fabric of reality itself. There was a sensation of falling, of being twisted inside out. And then, I opened my eyes. I was standing in Emily's apartment, the real one, with its modern furniture and soft beige walls. My coffee, long since gone cold, sat on the glass table where I'd left it. Shaking, I checked my phone. Only 30 minutes had passed since I'd left for my coffee run. It was as if the whole bizarre adventure had never happened. But as I sank onto the familiar gray couch, I noticed something on the coffee table that hadn't been there before. A single, long black hair, too big to be from Mr. Whiskers. And there, just for a moment in the corner of my eye, I could have sworn I saw a pair of glowing green eyes watching me from the shadows. I never told Emily about what happened in her apartment. How could I? She'd think I was crazy. But sometimes, late at night, I find myself listening for the sound of a grandfather clock that isn't there, or catching a whiff of that spicy, medicinal scent. And I wonder, how thin is the veil between realities? And what might slip through when we're not looking? The gas station appeared like a mirage in the desert of night, its neon sign a beacon of hope in the endless darkness. I pulled in, desperate for fuel and a moment's rest. Little did I know, I was about to enter a nightmare from which there might be no escape. I'd been driving for hours, making my way across the country for a new job opportunity. The highway had been empty for miles, nothing but the endless ribbon of asphalt stretching out before me. My eyelids were heavy, my mind foggy with exhaustion. When I saw the sign for Last Chance Gas, next service 100 miles, I knew I had to stop. The station looked old, the kind of place you'd expect to see in a movie about the 1950s. A single row of pumps stood under a rusted metal awning, and the small convenience store's windows glowed with a sickly fluorescent light. As I pulled up to the pump, I noticed there were no other cars around. Not surprising, given the late hour, but it still sent a shiver down my spine. I got out of my car, the cool night air shocking me awake. As I started to fuel up, I noticed a man watching me from inside the store. He was older, with a scraggly gray beard and eyes that seemed to glow in the harsh light. Something about his gaze made me uncomfortable, but I chalked it up to my exhaustion and overactive imagination. Once the tank was full, I headed inside to pay and maybe grab some coffee for the road. A bell jingled overhead as I pushed open the door, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet night. The store was cluttered, shelves stocked with a bizarre mix of everyday items and things I'd never seen before. Cans of food sat next to jars of what looked like preserved animals. Bags of chips shared space with bundles of dried herbs tied with twine. And everywhere, watching me from every surface, were dolls. Old-fashioned porcelain dolls with cracked faces and glassy eyes that seemed to follow my every move. The old man stood behind the counter, still staring at me with those unsettling eyes. As I approached, he smiled, revealing teeth that were just a bit too sharp. "Welcome to Last Chance," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "Find everything you need?" I nodded, placing my coffee on the counter. "Just this and the gas, thanks." He rang me up, his movements slow and deliberate. As he handed me my change, his fingers brushed against mine. They were ice cold, and I jerked my hand back instinctively. The old man's smile widened. "Long drive ahead of you." "Yeah," I replied, eager to get out of there. "Trying to make it to the next town." He chuckled, the sound like gravel in a blender. "Oh, I wouldn't count on that. Folks who stop here tend to stick around for a while." I frowned, a sense of unease growing in my gut. "What do you mean?" But he just shook his head, still smiling that unnerving smile. "You'll see. Have a safe trip now." I hurried out of the store, the bell's jingle sounding more like a warning than a farewell. As I got back in my car, I could see the old man still watching me through the window. I started the engine and pulled out of the station, breathing a sigh of relief as it disappeared in my rearview mirror. The road stretched out before me, dark and empty. I sipped my coffee, trying to shake off the creepy feeling the gas station had left me with. Just my imagination running wild, I told myself. Nothing to worry about. But as I drove, something strange began to happen. The landscape started to look familiar. Too familiar. I could have sworn I passed the same dead tree, its branches reaching out like gnarled fingers, at least twice. And wasn't that the same oddly shaped rock formation I'd seen a few miles back? I checked my GPS, but the screen was blank. My phone showed no signal. Panic began to rise in my chest as I realized I had no idea where I was or how long I'd been driving. And then, up ahead, I saw it. The neon sign glowing in the darkness. Last chance gas. "No," I whispered. "This isn't possible." But there it was. The same rusted awning, the same cluttered store. And there, watching from the window, was the old man, waiting for me. I drove past, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. This had to be a mistake. Maybe there was more than one last chance gas. Maybe I'd gotten turned around somehow. I kept driving, my eyes darting between the road and my rearview mirror. The station disappeared into the darkness behind me, and for a moment I felt relieved. But the relief was short-lived. After what felt like hours of driving, but could have been minutes, I saw it again. The neon sign. The old man watching. Last chance gas. I drove past again, my heart pounding in my chest. This couldn't be happening. It defied all logic, all reason. But no matter how far I drove, no matter what direction I took, I always ended up back at that same gas station. On my fifth pass, I was nearly out of gas. I had no choice but to pull in. As I did, I saw the old man emerge from the store, that same unsettling smile on his face. "Welcome back," he called as I got out of the car. "Told you folks tend to stick around." "What is this place?" I demanded, fear and frustration making my voice shake. "What's going on?" He chuckled, shaking his head. "This is last chance, my friend. For some, it's a way station. For others, well, it's the end of the road." "I don't understand," I said, feeling close to tears. "I just want to leave, to get back on the highway and go home." The old man's eyes seemed to glow brighter. "Home? And where might that be? Are you sure you even remember?" I opened my mouth to respond, to tell him exactly where I was from and where I was going. But to my horror, I realized I couldn't remember. The details of my life before this endless night had become hazy, dreamlike. "What have you done to me?" I whispered. He shrugged, the movement unnaturally fluid. "I haven't done anything. Last chance has a way of simplifying things, stripping away the unnecessary. You're here because you need to be here, because you have something to learn, or something to forget." I shook my head, unwilling to accept his cryptic explanation. "There has to be a way out. Please just tell me how to leave." The old man considered me for a long moment, his ancient eyes seeming to peer into my very soul. Finally, he nodded. "There is a way," he said slowly. "But it's not easy. And once you start down that road, there's no turning back. Are you sure that's what you want?" I nodded eagerly, desperate for any chance to escape this nightmare. He sighed, suddenly looking very old and very tired. Very well. Go into the store. Behind the counter, you'll find a door. Take it. What happens next is up to you. Without waiting for further explanation, I rushed into the store. The dolls seemed to watch me as I made my way to the counter, their glassy eyes full of judgment. Behind the counter, just as the old man had said, was a door I hadn't noticed before. I hesitated for just a moment, my hand on the knob. What lay beyond? Was this truly an escape, or just another loop in this endless nightmare? But I knew I had no choice. Whatever waited on the other side of that door had to be better than being trapped here forever. I turned the knob and stepped through. I found myself back on the highway, my car humming beneath me as if I'd never stopped. The sky was beginning to lighten with the first rays of dawn. My GPS was working again, showing me on track to my destination. For a moment, I thought it had all been a dream, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and too much caffeine. But then I noticed something on the passenger seat. A small, cracked porcelain doll, its glassy eyes staring up at me. And I knew that last chance gas was out there somewhere, waiting for lost souls to stumble upon it. A place where reality bends and time loses all meaning. A place where you might find what you're looking for, or lose yourself entirely. I never told anyone about what happened that night. Who would believe me? But sometimes, on long drives when the night seems to stretch on forever, I find myself watching the side of the road, waiting, with a mix of dread and strange longing, for a familiar neon sign to appear in the darkness. Because once you've been to last chance, a part of you never really leaves, and a part of it never really lets you go.